Apologize right now or get out, my husband shouted as his entire family took turns humiliating me at Thanksgiving dinner. I did not argue. I quietly packed a suitcase, picked up our 4-year-old son, and bought 2 one-way tickets overseas. Just a few hours later, they panicked as every phone in the family started ringing non-stop because the massive medical empire they built on lies was officially burning to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family who thought they could break you. My name is Gwen. I am 30 years old, and I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days tracking missing corporate funds, analyzing offshore accounts, and dismantling complex financial fraud. For 3 years, I applied those exact same skills to my own marriage. My husband Preston was 34 years old and the vice president of his family's highly lucrative chain of luxury rehabilitation and wellness centers scattered across the West Coast. From the outside, we lived a flawless life in a sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion in the exclusive Broadmoor neighborhood of Seattle. Inside those walls, however, I was trapped in a psychological war zone surrounded by absolute narcissists who thought their wealth made them invincible. The defining moment of our marriage happened on Thanksgiving. We were hosting 20 elite guests, including local politicians, hospital board members, and prominent Seattle socialites. The dining table was a masterpiece of ostentatious wealth covered in silver serving trays and towering floral arrangements. Everyone was laughing, drinking expensive Cabernet, and enjoying the lavish feast. I was seated near the center of the table, quietly cutting a piece of turkey for our 4-year-old son Leo, who was blissfully unaware of the tension that always simmered beneath the surface of his grandparents' smiles. Suddenly, the sharp, violent sound of shattering crystal pierced the room. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, and the ruthless matriarch of the family's medical empire, had deliberately slammed her wine glass against the mahogany table. Deep red wine splashed across the white lace tablecloth and splattered directly onto my silk dress. The lively chatter in the dining room instantly died. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto Beatrice and then slowly shifted to me. Beatrice stood up, her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She announced to the dead silent room that she had just uncovered a massive financial discrepancy. According to her, I had maliciously embezzled $250,000 directly from my own son's trust fund. She did not stop there. She loudly proclaimed that I had stolen my child's future to fund a secret sordid affair with a fictional lover. The accusation was so outrageously false, so perfectly calculated, that for a split second the sheer audacity of it hung in the air like smoke. But I knew exactly what was happening. I was a forensic accountant. I had already traced that missing $250,000 weeks ago. Preston had quietly drained his son's trust fund to plug a massive bleeding hole in one of his corporate money laundering accounts before the upcoming year-end audit. Rather than face the music, he and his mother had concocted this spectacular public execution to frame me, discredit me, and cast me out of the family with absolutely nothing. Before anyone could even process Beatrice's vicious lie, Preston slammed his fists onto the table and escalated the conflict. He shoved his heavy dining chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. Playing the role of the devastated, betrayed husband with terrifying conviction, he marched around the table and cornered me. His face was red, his veins bulging as he loomed over me in front of the horrified guests. He screamed that he had given me everything, that he had elevated me from a miserable working-class background, and this was how I repaid his generosity. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and threw a thick legal document onto the table right in front of me. It was a post-nuptial agreement. "Apologize right now!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Get down on your knees. Apologize to my mother. Sign this document surrendering full custody of Leo, and maybe I will not have you arrested for grand larceny. If you refuse, get out of my house tonight with absolutely nothing." He took a threatening step closer, raising his hand as if he might physically drag me out of my chair. The guests gasped. Some looked away, too cowardly to intervene. But before Preston could close the distance, a massive figure moved with blinding speed across the room. Jamal, my 35-year-old African-American brother-in-law, positioned his broad shoulders squarely between Preston and me. Jamal was a highly respected trauma surgeon who had married Preston's older sister, Delilah. Despite his brilliance and prestigious career, the family secretly resented him whispering racist microaggressions behind his back because he refused to participate in their dirty medical billing schemes. Jamal had always been my only ally in that toxic house. Jamal grabbed Preston by the wrist, his grip like a steel vise. His voice was dangerously low, a deep rumble that sent a cold shiver through the room. "You touch her," Jamal warned, his eyes locked onto Preston's panicked face, "and I will break your arm in 3 different places. Do not test me, Preston." Preston tried to yank his arm away, but Jamal held firm, an immovable wall of quiet fury. The physical barrier gave me the exact space I needed. A normal person might have cried. A normal wife might have screamed, begged for her reputation, or desperately tried to explain the truth to the staring audience. I did none of those things. I felt zero emotional breakdown. The tears they so desperately wanted to see simply did not exist. I calmly picked up a pristine white cloth napkin from the table and deliberately wiped the spilled red wine from my silk dress. My movements were slow, measured, and completely devoid of fear. I looked directly into Preston's eyes, seeing the brief flash of confusion behind his manufactured rage. He expected a hysterical woman he could easily manipulate. Instead, he got a woman who had already won the war he thought he was just starting. I placed the stained napkin neatly on top of his ridiculous post-nuptial agreement. Without uttering a single word of defense or apology, I turned my back on the screaming family, walked past the stunned faces of the elite guests, and headed straight up the grand staircase. They thought they were kicking me out. They had no idea I was already executing a plan that would systematically destroy their entire lives. My name is Gwen, and my footsteps against the oak staircase were steady, a sharp contrast to the chaotic shouting erupting from the dining room below. I could hear Beatrice shrilly demanding that Jamal be thrown out, while Gregory attempted to placate the bewildered guests. None of that mattered now. The theatrical performance they had orchestrated was merely a distraction, a pathetic attempt to corner me before the looming audit exposed their rot. I walked straight down the hallway toward the only room that held anything of value to me. I opened the heavy wooden door to the nursery. Inside, the soft glow of a nightlight illuminated my 4-year-old son, Leo. He was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, completely insulated from the venomous people downstairs. I moved silently across the room without turning on the overhead light. I knew exactly where everything was. I gently lifted Leo from his mattress, wrapping his favorite fleece blanket securely around his small shoulders. He stirred slightly, letting out a soft sigh, and nestled his face into my neck without waking. Holding my son firmly against my hip with my left arm, I knelt beside the mahogany bookshelf built into the far wall. With my free hand, I pressed firmly against the bottom right corner of the baseboard. A hidden latch clicked. The wooden panel slid away effortlessly, revealing a shallow cavity beneath the floorboards. I reached inside and pulled out a tactical backpack. This was my emergency bag. It had been packed and ready for exactly 3 days ever since I had verified the final offshore wire transfer Preston had executed. Inside that bag were our passports, a large stack of untraceable cash, 2 untraceable burner phones, and most importantly, the encrypted black hard drive containing the digital equivalent of a nuclear bomb. I swung the strap over my right shoulder. The extraction was moving perfectly on schedule. The nursery door violently slammed open, rebounding off the wall with a deafening crack. Preston stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his tailored suit jacket discarded somewhere downstairs. His face was twisted into a hideous smirk, intoxicated by his own perceived power. Running away like a coward, he sneered, stepping into the room. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe to block my exit. "Where exactly do you think you are going to go? You have no money. I froze the joint accounts 30 minutes ago. You have no credit cards that I do not control. You are going to step out of this house and realize you are absolutely nothing without my family. He expected me to beg. He expected me to drop the bag, fall to my knees, and plead for access to our bank accounts. He expected panic. I offered him pure, chilling silence. I did not blink, and I certainly did not engage with his manic delusion. I tightened my grip on Leo, adjusted the weight of the backpack, and walked directly toward him. Preston did not move at first, trying to maintain his physically intimidating posture. But as I kept walking, my eyes locked dead ahead with an empty predator, like focus, his nerve faltered. He stepped aside just enough for me to brush past him into the hallway. I carried my son down the back staircase that led directly to the attached garage, ignoring the continuing tirade echoing behind me. "You are going to be begging on the streets by morning," Preston yelled, trailing closely behind me as my heels clicked down the wooden stairs. He was practically vibrating with toxic excitement, absolutely thrilled by the prospect of watching me suffer. "My mother will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that no firm in this country will ever hire you again. You are a pathetic thief. You are a terrible mother. You are going to lose this boy forever, and you are going to lose everything." I pushed open the heavy fire door and stepped onto the cold concrete floor of the garage. My black SUV was parked in its usual spot, fueled and serviced. I opened the rear passenger door, carefully settling Leo into his car seat and securing the 5-point harness with practiced efficiency. Leo kept his eyes closed, lulled by the familiar motion. I tossed the tactical backpack onto the floorboard beneath his feet, right where I could reach it if necessary, and shut the door with a solid thud. Preston had followed me to the driver's side door, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. He slapped his hand against the hood of my car, leaning in close, smelling of expensive wine and cheap arrogance. I quickly slipped into the driver's seat, pulled the heavy door shut, and instantly engaged the central locking system. The heavy locks clicked simultaneously, severing his physical access to us. I started the engine. The powerful motor roared to life. Through the reinforced glass, I could see his mouth moving, his face contorted in a furious scream as he pounded his fist against the window. I pressed the button to roll the window down 1 inch. The cold Seattle air rushed in, carrying the sound of his frantic threats. Before he could unleash another barrage of insults, I looked him dead in the eye, my voice cutting through the noise like a razor blade. "You seem to have forgotten what I do for a living, Preston. I am a forensic accountant. I find the money that people like you think is invisible." I hit the button, sealing the window shut, cutting off his stunned silence. Shifting the transmission into reverse, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched violently against the smooth concrete, leaving dark streaks as I backed out of the garage and into the freezing rain. I merged onto the wet street, leaving Preston standing alone in the driveway, a completely helpless silhouette fading rapidly in my rearview mirror as I drove toward the airport. The heavy Seattle rain battered the windshield of my SUV as I merged onto Interstate 5 South. The rhythmic swoosh of the wipers was the only sound inside the cabin, a stark contrast to the explosive chaos I had just left behind. In the rearview mirror, I could make out the gentle rise and fall of Leo, sleeping peacefully in his car seat. He was safe. Now I just had to make sure we stayed that way. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, navigating the slick asphalt with calculated precision. My pulse hummed with adrenaline, but my mind was completely clear. I had spent 3 years calculating this exact escape route, accounting for every variable, every weather condition, and every potential obstacle between the Broadmoor neighborhood and Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. 10 minutes into the drive, the silence was shattered. The dashboard console screen illuminated, flashing bright red in the darkened cabin. A notification chime rang out, then another, then a rapid, unending sequence of aggressive pings that threatened to wake Leo. I reached over and muted the audio alerts, letting the visual notifications stack up on the display. Preston had discovered his hidden safe was empty. He had finally realized that the encrypted black hard drive, the digital vault containing every piece of incriminating evidence regarding his massive Medicare fraud syndicate, was no longer secured behind his biometric locks. It was sitting in the tactical backpack right beneath our son. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow, tearing away the arrogant facade he had displayed in the dining room and leaving only raw, unfiltered panic. I kept my eyes on the wet road, instructing the car voice assistant to read the incoming messages aloud over the driver's side speaker. Preston started with his trademark arrogance. He typed that I was making a fool of myself, that I would be crawling back by midnight, begging for forgiveness. He called my escape a pathetic tantrum. But as the miles ticked by and the reality of the missing hard drive fully set in, his tone fractured. The messages devolved rapidly into unhinged, desperate warfare. He promised to unleash his family corporate legal team by dawn. He swore he would manufacture evidence of drug abuse to ensure a judge stripped my parental rights permanently. He detailed exactly how his mother would leverage her connections with the local media to paint me as a deranged, embezzling housewife. He typed out pure venom, promising his wealth would bury me so deep I would never see daylight, let alone my child, ever again. He thought his words were weapons. He did not realize he was just handing me more ammunition. I did not text back. Engaging with a narcissist is a fatal tactical error. Instead, I activated the vehicle voice command system. I instructed the onboard computer to mirror my phone directly to a secure offshore server I had established months prior in Reykjavik. With a simple verbal confirmation, every threatening text, every abusive voicemail, and every frantic email Preston sent was instantly duplicated, encrypted, and filed into a remote digital vault well outside the jurisdiction of his expensive Seattle lawyers. He was actively documenting his own extortion attempts in real time, building my custody case for me with every frantic keystroke. I listened to his threats bounce off the satellite connection, entirely untouchable and completely unaffected by his rage. However, the digital assault was only half the battle. Preston was arrogant, but he was not stupid. Once he realized I was not responding to his digital warfare, he would undoubtedly escalate to physical interception. His family kept a private security contractor on retainer, a firm staffed by former military operatives who specialized in making corporate problems disappear quietly. They knew my vehicle. They knew my license plate. They likely had access to traffic camera networks through their corrupt municipal contacts. I continuously scanned my rearview mirror, watching the sea of headlights reflecting off the rain-soaked highway. Every dark SUV that merged behind me caused my grip on the steering wheel to tighten. A heavy black truck pulled into my lane, maintaining a distance of exactly 2 car lengths. It did not pass when the left lane opened. It just matched my speed, mirroring my every lane change as we approached the airport exit. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped my speed by 10 miles per hour. The truck slowed down with me. I accelerated rapidly and the truck matched the surge. This was not a coincidence. Preston had dispatched his hounds. I needed to break their visual contact before reaching the terminal, or they would intercept me at the drop-off curb and physically block me from entering the airport with Leo. I waited until the very last possible second before the upcoming exit ramp. I jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, cutting across 2 lanes of wet traffic without using a turn signal. Horns blared around me as my tires momentarily lost traction, hydroplaning slightly before the all-wheel drive system engaged and gripped the pavement. I rocketed down the exit ramp toward a tangled network of surface streets. In the mirror, I saw the black truck attempt to make the same aggressive maneuver, but a massive commercial semi-truck blocked its path, trapping the private security vehicle on the interstate. I exhaled a sharp breath, navigating the back roads that ran parallel to the airport perimeter. I took 3 random turns through an industrial park to ensure no one had followed my detour. The rain was coming down harder now, giving me the perfect cover of darkness. I pulled back onto the main airport approach from a side entrance, entirely bypassing the primary highway toll booths where they might have had someone waiting. The glowing signs for the departure terminals finally appeared through the heavy downpour. I guided my SUV into the crowded parking structure, pulling into a spot near the elevators. The physical pursuit was neutralized, and the digital threats were safely archived offshore. I turned off the engine and looked back at Leo. The real trap was waiting for us inside the building. I hoisted Leo onto my left hip, the heavy tactical backpack securely strapped over my right shoulder, and stepped out of the parking garage elevator into the glaring fluorescent lights of the departure terminal. The clock was working against me. Preston had infinite resources and a legal team that operated more like a private mafia. I knew they would not rely solely on physical thugs in black trucks. They would weaponize the law. I navigated the bustling concourse with purposeful strides, blending in with the late-night travelers. Leo was awake now, rubbing his eyes and burying his face into my collarbone. I whispered soft reassurances to him, keeping my head down as we approached the main security checkpoint. The line was moderately long, a serpentine queue of tired families and business travelers. I kept my eyes fixed on the Transportation Security Administration agents ahead, watching their screens and their body language. Every time a radio crackled or an agent glanced up, my muscles coiled tight. I knew Preston and his attorneys were frantically dialing judges, calling in favors, and trying to throw a bureaucratic net over the entire airport. We moved through the scanner without incident, but the true bottleneck was always the boarding gate. Once you are past security, you are confined. You are a sitting duck waiting in a designated holding pen. I practically carried Leo down the long carpeted concourse toward the international terminal, my eyes darting toward every uniform I passed. We finally reached our gate. The red-eye flight to London Heathrow was boarding in 20 minutes. Passengers were already congregating near the podium, restless and eager to board. I found a seat near a structural column, positioning my body between Leo and the main thoroughfare. 10 minutes passed. I was just beginning to let my guard down when the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. Two Port of Seattle police officers strode purposefully down the concourse, their eyes scanning the faces of the waiting passengers. They were not casually patrolling. They were looking for someone specific. They held a printed photograph and a mobile tablet. My heart executed a heavy, painful drop, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. I did not avert my gaze. I did not shrink away. I watched them approach, knowing exactly who had sent them. The taller officer, a broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, locked eyes with me. He tapped his partner on the arm, and they altered their trajectory, cutting straight through the crowd of waiting passengers to stand directly over me. The taller officer said, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. "Are you Gwendolyn Pierce?" I stood up, shifting Leo to my other hip. "Yes, officer. How can I help you?" The second officer stepped forward, holding up his tablet. "We need you to hand over your identification and the travel documents for the child immediately. We have received an emergency alert from a family court judge regarding a potential parental kidnapping. You are legally flagged for flight risk, and we have orders to detain you until Child Protective Services and the child's father arrive to take custody." A collective gasp rippled through the passengers sitting nearby. The audience of weary travelers suddenly became extremely attentive, anticipating the devastating breakdown of a desperate mother caught in the act of stealing her child. They expected me to cry, beg, or deny the accusations. They expected a scene. Instead, I offered the officers a polite, almost pitying smile. I knew exactly how Preston had orchestrated this. He had roused his corrupt legal team from their holiday beds, throwing thousands of dollars at them to wake up a judge he had in his pocket. They had filed an emergency motion painting me as a deranged flight risk mother. It was a classic aggressive power play designed to humiliate me and trap me in the terminal until Preston could arrive and personally tear Leo from my arms. "Officers, I completely understand you are just doing your jobs," I said, my voice projecting calm authority. "However, the information you were given by my husband's attorneys is entirely fraudulent. I am not kidnapping my son. I have sole unassailable legal custody, and I have the documentation to prove it right here." I knelt down and unzipped the front compartment of my tactical bag. The officers watched me closely, clearly skeptical of my total lack of panic. I pulled out a thick, rigid manila envelope. I stood back up and extracted a crisp, professionally bound legal document, handing it directly to the lead officer. The document was a voluntary surrender of parental rights and a full authorization of sole physical and legal custody to me. At the bottom of the last page, signed in bold black ink, was Preston's unmistakable signature. Next to it was the official raised seal of his own corporate notary. The backstory of that document was my ultimate masterpiece. Preston was a man who possessed a lethal combination of supreme arrogance and extreme laziness. He considered administrative tasks entirely beneath his intellect. For 3 years, I had handled every piece of paperwork in our household and his personal businesses. A week prior to Thanksgiving, I had handed him a massive 300-page stack of quarterly tax filings and asset management renewals. I placed sticky notes indicating where he needed to sign. He had scoffed, rolled his eyes at the volume of paper, and rapidly scrawled his signature exactly where I told him to without reading a single word. He even had his loyal, unquestioning assistant notarize the entire stack in bulk. He never realized that buried in those pages was an airtight, legally binding custody transfer. The taller officer frowned, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. He flipped to the signature page, running his thumb over the raised notary seal. He handed the document to his partner, who cross-referenced the notary registration number with the state database on his tablet. The seconds ticked by, heavy and loaded with tension. I stood perfectly still, stroking Leo's back as the officers silently communicated. "This seal is verified," the second officer muttered, looking up from his screen with a bewildered expression. "The signature matches the database, and the document is registered and legally binding. The injunction we received was filed under the premise of shared custody, but this contract supersedes it completely." He willingly signed away his rights. The lead officer sighed, visibly frustrated by the bureaucratic mess he had been dragged into. He handed the document back to me. "My apologies for the interruption, ma'am. This court order is valid. You are free to board your flight. Have a safe trip to London." They stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea, just as the gate agent announced the final boarding call for my flight. I tucked the document safely back into my bag, handed my boarding pass to the stunned gate agent, and walked down the jet bridge. Thousands of miles away, I knew Preston and his high-priced lawyers were staring at a faxed copy of that exact same document, finally realizing they had hit an impenetrable legal brick wall. I stepped onto the aircraft, closing the chapter on my Seattle nightmare. The cabin doors sealed shut with a heavy, satisfying thud, locking the damp Pacific Northwest weather outside and sealing us in our sanctuary. I found our assigned seats in the dim, quiet business class cabin. I buckled Leo in, tucking the fleece blanket securely under his chin, and watched as his breathing immediately slowed into a deep, uninterrupted rhythm. The massive jet pushed back from the gate, taxiing toward the runway. As the engines roared to full throttle and the aircraft pitched upward into the night sky, the crushing gravity of the past 3 years seemed to lift from my chest. I watched the sprawling, glittering grid of Seattle shrink into insignificance through the oval window. We broke through the dense cloud cover, climbing steadily until the captain chimed over the intercom announcing we had reached a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft ding. It was time to go to work. I reached down between my feet and pulled the heavy tactical backpack onto my lap. Unzipping the reinforced main compartment, I bypassed the stacks of banded currency and the burner phones, reaching instead for the smooth, cold metal of the encrypted black hard drive. This small, unassuming rectangle of silicon and aluminum was the beating heart of Preston's entire bloodline. It was the master ledger. I set my secure laptop on the tray table, plugging the drive into the side port. The screen flickered to life, immediately throwing up a stark red authentication prompt. I quickly connected to the aircraft's onboard Wi-Fi, navigating the slow satellite uplink with practiced patience. I immediately routed my signal through 3 nested virtual private networks layered across servers in Switzerland, Panama, and Iceland. I was a ghost in the machine, operating from a metal tube hurtling across the stratosphere. The red prompt blinked steadily, demanding the master decryption key. Preston was an arrogant man, but he was deeply paranoid about his wealth. He had secured the drive with military-grade encryption, boasting once that it would take a supercomputer 10,000 years to crack the code. But human arrogance is always the weakest link in any security chain. Over the course of our marriage, I had watched his eyes track across his keyboard, memorizing the specific cadence and rhythm of his keystrokes when he thought I was not paying attention. I typed in the complex 24-character alphanumeric cipher without hesitating. The letters and numbers flowed from my memory directly through my fingertips. The red prompt instantly dissolved into a sea of green data. The vault was open. I pulled up the primary directory, scanning the meticulously organized folders. Here laid the irrefutable ugly truth of their luxury rehabilitation empire. The family was not curing anyone. They were operating a massive systematic Medicare fraud syndicate. I opened the billing ledgers, my eyes scanning the endless rows of fabricated data. They were billing the federal government tens of millions of dollars for ghost patients. These were people who had never set foot in their high-end clinics, deceased individuals whose identities had been stolen, and completely fictitious profiles generated to bleed the system dry. Every fake therapy session, every phantom blood test, every non-existent pharmaceutical prescription was itemized, categorized, and charged directly to the taxpayers. But the real masterpiece was their sprawling laundering operation. I traced the flow of the illicit capital as they funneled the stolen federal funds through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. The money bounced through dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Belize, effectively washing the dirty currency before it returned seamlessly to fund their Seattle mansions and luxury vehicles. I did not just possess a smoking gun. I held the entire armory. I opened a pre-written script on my desktop, an automated distribution protocol I had coded weeks ago in the dead of night, while Preston slept off his expensive scotch. I attached the decrypted master ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, the ghost patient directories, and the internal family emails explicitly discussing the mechanics of the fraud. I dragged the massive, highly explosive zip file into the distribution queue. My targets were selected with absolute precision. I loaded the direct secured contact channels for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Unit, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. To ensure the family could not use their vast wealth to quietly buy their way out of a federal probe, I added a secondary layer to the blast radius. I linked the secure tip lines of 5 major investigative news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Once the relentless national press had the raw data in their hands, the ensuing public circus would force the government agencies to act immediately and transparently. There would be no backroom deals, no sealed indictments swept under the rug, and absolutely no escape for Beatrice or her sons. I checked the secure connection one last time, verifying the encryption tunnels and ensuring my digital footprints were completely erased from the payload. I hovered my finger over the return key. This was the absolute point of no return. Once this data hit the servers, the medical empire they had built on the backs of vulnerable people would implode with catastrophic force. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner happening miles below me, the shattered crystal, the arrogant demands, and the sheer cruelty they had inflicted upon me for years, thinking I was too weak to strike back. I looked at my sons sleeping peacefully beside me, safe from their toxic grasp and their corrupt legacy. Without a single shred of hesitation or regret, I pressed execute. The automated script took over. A progress bar appeared in the center of my screen, filling rapidly with a bright green light as the massive data packets burst through the encrypted satellite uplink. The aircraft Wi-Fi strained under the heavy load, but the connection held steady. 90%, 95%, 100%. Transmission confirmed. I ejected the hard drive, slipped it back into my bag, and gently closed the laptop. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, pulling a blanket over my legs, and stared out into the pitch-black sky. I had just armed a catastrophic, unavoidable ticking time bomb, and the countdown had officially started for the family back in Seattle. Back in the Broadmoor neighborhood, the atmosphere inside the sprawling brick mansion was thick with the scent of roasted sage and expensive cologne. The mahogany dining table had been cleared of the lavish main courses, replaced by towering crystal platters of artisanal desserts. Preston held court at the head of the table, a snifter of aged bourbon in his hand. He was entirely back in his element, his chest puffed out as he regaled the remaining wealthy guests with a heavily edited version of the night's events. He leaned back in his tailored chair, swirling the amber liquid, loudly bragging about how he had just put his hysterical wife in her place. He painted a picture of a benevolent but firm patriarch dealing with a fragile, emotionally unstable woman. He assured the rapt audience of local politicians, hospital administrators, and country club socialites that Gwen was simply having a minor breakdown and had been sent to a luxury wellness retreat to clear her head. The guests offered sympathetic murmurs and polite nods, completely buying into the carefully constructed narrative. Beatrice sat at the opposite end of the table, presiding over the dessert service with her usual icy elegance. She wore a smug, satisfied expression, entirely convinced that the unpleasantness had been handled and the family reputation preserved. She signaled for the head catering manager, a nervous young man in a crisp white uniform, to bring the final invoice for the evening's extravagant feast. The manager approached with a silver tray, presenting the leather-bound folio containing the bill. It was a staggering sum, representing days of preparation, imported ingredients, and a small army of staff. Beatrice did not even glance at the itemized charges. She retrieved her exclusive heavy metal black card from her clutch and dropped it onto the silver tray with a loud, dismissive clatter. She instructed him to add a generous 20% gratuity and process the transaction immediately so the staff could begin clearing the estate. The young manager bowed his head respectfully and retreated to a discreet alcove near the kitchen swinging doors to run the charge through his mobile terminal. The dining room continued to hum with the low-cultured chatter of Seattle's elite. Gregory was pouring another glass of wine for a prominent local judge, while the family chief financial officer, Arthur Pendleton, was locked in a quiet conversation with a venture capitalist about the upcoming quarter's revenue projections. Everything appeared perfectly normal, a flawless execution of high society socializing. Then the catering manager returned to the table. He was no longer walking with practiced invisibility. His face was flushed, and a sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead. He approached Beatrice, clutching the leather folio and the heavy metal card. He leaned down, attempting to speak quietly, but the sheer panic in his voice caused his words to carry across the suddenly quiet dining room. He apologized profusely, stammering as he informed Beatrice that the card had been declined. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended over the immediate vicinity. Beatrice stared at the young man as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. She snatched the card from the tray, her manicured nails digging into the metal. She informed him, her voice dripping with venomous condescension, that he had obviously made a mistake. She instructed him to run it again, asserting that the card had no limit and that his machine was clearly malfunctioning. The manager swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he held up the small terminal. He stated that he had already tried processing the transaction 3 times. The system was not just declining the charge. The terminal screen was displaying a stark red message, instructing the merchant to confiscate the card and contact the issuing bank immediately regarding a federal hold. Preston slammed his bourbon glass onto the table, the sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. He stood up, furious that a hired vendor was disrespecting his mother in front of their esteemed guests. He marched over to the alcove, pulling his own platinum card from his wallet. He shoved it at the manager, ordering him to run the charge, take his tip, and get his staff out of their house. The manager swiped Preston's card. The terminal beeped twice. Declined. The exact same red warning flashed across the screen. Confiscate card. Federal hold. Before Preston could unleash a tirade on the terrified caterer, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the silence. It was Preston's private mobile phone. A second later, Gregory's phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany table. Across the room, Arthur Pendleton's jacket pocket lit up with a rapid succession of audible alerts. The synchronization of the ringing was unnatural, a jarring mechanical chorus that immediately changed the energy in the room, from uncomfortable to deeply alarming. Preston snatched his phone from his pocket. The caller ID displayed his private wealth manager at their Swiss banking institution. He answered gruffly, turning away from the guests. Gregory answered his device, simultaneously pressing it to his ear as he listened to a frantic voice on the other end. Arthur Pendleton did not even need to answer a call. He was staring at his smartphone screen, his jaw hanging slack, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. Automated security alerts were flooding their devices in a relentless, unstoppable wave. The notifications cascaded across their screens, bringing catastrophic news. The primary offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands were reporting complete lockouts. The secondary holding companies in Cyprus were severed from the global banking network. The massive diversified stock portfolios managed by their Wall Street brokers had been frozen entirely, citing emergency regulatory mandates. But the most devastating alerts were coming directly from domestic institutions. Federal holds had been placed on every single corporate asset tied to the medical clinics. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had initiated an immediate total freeze on their operational capital. The Securities and Exchange Commission had triggered emergency injunctions. The banks were legally prohibited from authorizing any transfers, withdrawals, or liquidations. The family syndicate had been financially decapitated in a matter of seconds. The immense, seemingly untouchable wealth that insulated them from the world had simply vanished into the digital ether, locked behind impenetrable government firewalls. Preston dropped his phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the screen cracking upon impact. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had been bragging just minutes earlier. The bourbon in his stomach suddenly felt like battery acid. Gregory was shouting into his phone, demanding answers that his panicked broker could not legally provide. Arthur Pendleton clutched his chest, sinking heavily into a velvet dining chair as he hyperventilated. As the CFO, he recognized the terrifying scope of the federal exposure instantly. He knew exactly what a synchronized multi-agency freeze meant. The master ledgers were out in the open. The authorities knew everything. The wealthy guests remained frozen in their seats, clutching their crystal glasses with white knuckles. The elegant Thanksgiving dinner had transformed into a crime scene waiting to happen. They watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the impenetrable facade of the family wealth crumbled into dust right before their eyes. The polished veneer of invincibility was gone, replaced by raw, suffocating terror. The local politicians slowly set down their silk napkins, quietly calculating how quickly they could distance their campaigns from the radioactive fallout. The hospital administrators avoided eye contact with everyone, their minds racing with the legal implications of their lucrative associations with the clinics. The untouchable empire was burning to the ground right in front of them, consumed by an invisible digital inferno, and there was absolutely nothing Preston could do to stop it. The kingdom was gone. The suffocating silence gripping the dining room shattered as a distant, piercing wail cut through the heavy Seattle rain. The sound was faint, at first, a singular, high-pitched mechanical shriek, but it multiplied rapidly, converging on the estate from multiple directions. The local politicians and hospital administrators, men and women who had spent the entire evening dining on imported truffles and sipping aged bourbon, suddenly understood the devastating gravity of the synchronized phone alerts. Panic, raw and utterly undignified, erupted among the elite attendees. Heavy chairs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floors as the guests scrambled toward the exits. They abandoned their cashmere coats and half-empty crystal snifters, desperate to physically distance themselves from the radioactive epicenter of the imploding medical syndicate. But the sweeping private driveway was already blocked. The rhythmic, blinding pulse of red and blue strobes flooded the massive dining room windows, casting violent, disorienting shadows across the ruined Thanksgiving feast. Before Arthur Pendleton could even draw a ragged breath to warn the family, the heavy, custom-built oak front doors were violently breached. A deafening, splintering crash echoed through the grand foyer as a tactical battering ram obliterated the reinforced hinges. solid wood fragmented raining down on the imported marble tiles as a heavily armed tactical team flooded the entryway. These were not the polite, deferential local police officers the family was accustomed to controlling with a single phone call or a campaign donation. Dozens of federal agents wearing stark navy windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow lettering swarmed the mansion. They moved with terrifying coordinated military precision, instantly locking down the sprawling first floor. The grand foyer, previously a pristine monument to the family's manufactured prestige, was immediately transformed into the staging ground for a massive, unyielding federal raid. A senior agent, his face set in grim, unyielding determination, marched directly into the formal dining room. He bypassed the few remaining terrified guests, his heavy boots tracking wet mud and debris across the priceless Persian rugs, and headed straight for the family patriarchs. Gregory, attempting to salvage some shred of his polished authority, stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating diplomatic gesture. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to drop the names of senators, appellate judges, and high-ranking municipal officials he believed he owned. He never got the chance to utter a single syllable. The lead agent forcefully shoved a thick, heavy stack of federal warrants directly into Gregory's chest, forcing the older man to grab the paperwork instinctively to avoid being struck. The sprawling legal document authorized a comprehensive unrestricted search and seizure operation covering the entire property, all electronic devices, and every scrap of financial documentation on the premises. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering and brutally efficient. Teams of specialized cyber investigators marched straight past the shattered remnants of the dessert spread, heading directly for the basement office suite and the hidden server rooms. They began dismantling the physical infrastructure of the fraud ring, ruthlessly ripping Ethernet cables from the walls and hauling out heavy towers of blinking hardware. Other agents focused on the tangible assets bought with stolen government funds. Armed personnel stood guard over the imported Renaissance artwork lining the hallways, methodically sticking asset forfeiture tags onto ancient marble sculptures and priceless oil paintings. Locked filing cabinets were pried open with heavy steel crowbars, the aggressive screech of tearing metal completely replacing the polite string quartet music that had played just an hour earlier. Every lavish, opulent item in the home was being cataloged as the illegal proceeds of a massive criminal enterprise. Preston finally snapped out of his shock-induced paralysis. The sight of federal agents casually cataloging his mother's antique silver collection sent him into a blind, spittle-flying rage. He lunged toward the lead investigator, his face contorted in an ugly mask of absolute fury. He screamed for his high-priced corporate attorneys, his voice cracking wildly as he demanded the agents stop the seizure and focus their attention elsewhere. He pointed a shaking, furious finger toward the shattered front doors, hysterically demanding they dispatch units to track down his wife. He shrieked that Gwen was the real criminal, loudly accusing her of grand larceny, corporate espionage, and parental kidnapping. He demanded her immediate arrest, his voice echoing shrilly over the organized, methodical chaos of the raid. The lead investigator did not even blink at the unhinged tirade. He simply offered a cold, indifferent nod to two burly tactical officers standing nearby. They moved instantly, grabbing Preston by the arms, twisting his wrists around, and slamming him face first onto the mahogany dining table. His cheek crashed directly into a silver platter of artisanal tartlets, sending shattered crystal and crushed pastry flying across the table surface. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed over Preston's muffled, furious shouts as his face was pressed into the ruined dessert. Another pair of officers mirrored the action, with Gregory roughly securing the stunned, speechless patriarch in rigid restraints right beside his son, pinning them both helplessly against the Thanksgiving spread. Beatrice witnessed the brutal, unforgiving subjugation of her heirs from the far end of the long room. The sight of Preston and Gregory face down in the scattered food with their hands bound tightly behind their backs finally broke her mind. The icy, untouchable elegance she had cultivated for decades dissolved instantly into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, her knees buckling as her expensive designer gown pooled around her in a crumpled, pathetic heap. She pressed her hands to her face, realizing with crushing clarity that her social destruction was absolute and irreversible. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of helicopter rotor blades began to rattle the crystal chandeliers above them, growing deafeningly loud. Multiple news choppers were already circling low over the Broadmoor estate, their high-powered spotlights cutting through the freezing rain to broadcast the family's total, unmitigated ruin to the entire world. The harsh glare of the morning sun offered no reprieve from the overnight destruction illuminating the sterile concrete walls of the federal courthouse holding cell. Preston sat on the bolted steel bench, his bespoke suit rumpled and stained with the dried remnants of the catering manager's pastries. He did not look broken. Instead, his eyes burned with a venomous, unyielding fury. By 10 o'clock, his battalion of high-priced defense attorneys had managed to secure a temporary draconian bail arrangement. The judge, citing the overwhelming flight risk given the frozen offshore assets, demanded the surrender of his passport and the immediate installation of a heavy GPS-enabled ankle monitor. Preston signed the release documents with a vicious slash of the pen, his mind already discarding the reality of his criminal exposure and focusing entirely on a singular, consuming goal of absolute vengeance. Walking out of the courthouse flanked by silent bodyguards who shielded him from the aggressive swarm of local reporters, Preston refused to accept defeat. The medical empire was in ashes, but he still possessed the one currency that mattered in his circle's leverage. He ordered his driver to bypass the Broadmoor estate, now an active federal crime scene crawling with forensic accountants, and head directly to a nondescript brutalist office building in downtown Bellevue. His personal devices had been seized, but Preston had always maintained a shadow network separate from the family's primary syndicate. Inside a soundproof, windowless conference room, Preston met with Elias Thorne, a disgraced former intelligence officer who now operated a clandestine private security firm catering to the ultra-wealthy. Thorne specialized in extra-legal problem-solving, utilizing a network of dirty bureaucrats, corrupt officials, and compromised international agents. Preston did not waste time with pleasantries. He paced the length of the room, the plastic ankle monitor scraping against his tailored slacks, and laid out his ruthless countermaneuver. He needed Gwen stopped before she could vanish into the European expanse, and he needed it done with the full, terrifying weight of international law. Preston understood that attempting to charge his wife with stealing financial ledgers would only validate the FBI's current investigation. He needed a completely separate, highly explosive narrative that would supersede the domestic fraud case. He instructed Thorne to fabricate a comprehensive dossier accusing Gwen of orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar corporate espionage campaign. Thorne's operatives immediately went to work generating forged digital footprints, doctored email transcripts, and fake encrypted server logs. They painted a meticulously detailed picture of a rogue operative who had spent the last 3 years systematically stealing proprietary, highly classified medical patents from the family's research division with the explicit intent of selling the intellectual property to hostile foreign rivals. The lie was audacious, complex, and flawlessly executed. Thorne leveraged a deeply compromised contact within a European law enforcement liaison office, pushing the fabricated evidence through back channels. Within hours, a fraudulent Interpol red notice was officially generated and pushed to the global database. Gwen was no longer a fleeing mother or a whistleblower. She was officially flagged as a high-priority international fugitive wanted for catastrophic intellectual property theft and corporate sabotage. Preston stood by the conference room table watching the red notice materialize on Thorne's encrypted monitor. A cold, triumphant smile finally broke across his exhausted features. He viewed this as his absolute masterstroke. The trap was perfectly set, waiting across the Atlantic. He calculated her flight trajectory, knowing the massive commercial jet would be entering British airspace soon. The moment the aircraft wheels touched down on the tarmac at Heathrow, the passenger manifest would trigger the automated international watch lists. He visualized the impending sequence of events with sadistic satisfaction. Armed British border police would storm the cabin before the passengers were even allowed to unbuckle their seatbelts. Gwen would be ripped from her seat, humiliated and terrified in front of hundreds of strangers. More importantly, the authorities would immediately separate her from Leo, placing the boy in the custody of Foreign Child Protective Services while they dragged her to an interrogation room. Preston poured himself a glass of water from the conference table pitcher, his confidence fully restored. The Interpol warrant was a weapon of mass destruction, but it was also a tool for extortion. Once Gwen was locked inside a concrete cell in London, isolated, stripped of her rights, and frantic for the safety of their son Preston, planned to execute his final play. He would deploy his international legal team to present her with a devil's bargain. She would have to formally recant all the evidence she had provided to the FBI, signing a sworn affidavit, confessing that she had fabricated the Medicare fraud ledgers to cover up her own corporate espionage. She would take the sole blame for the server breaches and the stolen data. In exchange for her total submission and her public confession, Preston would agree to quietly withdraw the Interpol warrant and drop the corporate theft charges. He would grant her freedom, but the price would be absolute surrender. She would be allowed to walk away utterly discredited and permanently silenced while he regained custody of Leo and used her confession to derail the federal prosecution back in Seattle. Preston stared blindly at the wall, his mind buzzing with the anticipated victory. He had been outmaneuvered once, but he was entirely convinced that by the time the sun set over the British Isles, his runaway wife would be begging him for mercy. The heavy tires of the transatlantic jet struck the Heathrow tarmac, with a bone-jarring thud violently severing the quiet isolation of the flight. Gwen jolted from a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion as the massive engines roared in reverse thrust, throwing her weight against the seatbelt. Beside her, Leo stirred from a deep, oblivious sleep, rubbing his eyes and letting out a soft, confused murmur. Rain streaked diagonally across the oval window, distorting the dreary, sprawling gray expanse of the London morning. The seatbelt sign chimed off with a sharp ping, immediately unleashing a chaotic, claustrophobic scramble of passengers hauling oversized luggage from the overhead compartments. Gwen ignored the frantic rush. She moved with deliberate, methodical precision, adjusting the reinforced straps of the heavy tactical backpack, ensuring the encrypted hard drive pressed securely against her spine. She hoisted her son into her arms, whispering quiet, grounding reassurances into his ear as they finally merged into the slow, shuffling procession, inching down the narrow aircraft aisle. The stale, recycled cabin air instantly gave way to the sharp metallic chill of the jet bridge. Gwen adjusted her grip on Leo, her boots stepping onto the corrugated metal floor. The muffled roar of the airport terminal drifted through the enclosed tunnel, but as she rounded the final corner, the noise seemed to vanish entirely. Standing rigidly at the threshold of the gate, forming a deliberate wall across the exit path, were 4 individuals in impeccably tailored charcoal suits. They were completely motionless, their earpieces coiled tightly behind their ears, their eyes scanning the disembarking crowd with cold, predatory efficiency. Their posture screamed high-level law enforcement. For a fraction of a second, the oxygen left Gwen's lungs. Her pulse hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. Preston's reach was vast, his resources practically limitless, and his cruelty knew no bounds. Had he somehow discovered the digital payload before the servers were seized? Had he managed to manipulate the international watch lists and frame her before the federal raid completely neutralized him? She tightened her hold on Leo, her muscles coiled tight like a compressed spring. Fully expecting the harsh bark of an arrest warrant, the reading of fabricated charges, or the violent clamp of cold steel around her wrists. She envisioned the horrifying scenario Preston would orchestrate, ripping her child away in a foreign country and leveraging her freedom for a recantation. She did not break stride, projecting an aura of absolute calm she did not feel. As she closed the final few yards, the tallest of the suits stepped forward smoothly, intercepting her trajectory. He was a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped silver hair and a completely unreadable, stoic expression. He reached inside his breast pocket, a sudden movement that caused Gwen's breath to hitch in her throat. But he did not produce handcuffs or a weapon. Instead, he flashed a leather credential wallet, revealing the distinctive glint of a United Kingdom law enforcement crest. He did not issue commands, and he did not declare her an international fugitive. The man offered a crisp, deeply respectful nod, lowering his head slightly. "Director Vance," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the ambient noise of the terminal. "Welcome to London. We have been expecting your arrival. Please come with us." The suffocating tension instantly evaporated, replaced by a massive surge of pure, calculated adrenaline. The trap Preston thought he had so brilliantly set was a pathetic, laughable illusion. He had always assumed Gwen was nothing more than a fragile, submissive trophy wife he had rescued from obscurity, a quiet woman he could control with wealth and intimidation. He had never bothered to look past the carefully constructed, flawless cover story she had maintained for 6 agonizing years. He never suspected for a single moment that she was a deep-cover financial crimes specialist, an operative embedded by a joint task force to dismantle his bloodline's entire corrupt syndicate from the inside out. The British authorities immediately flanked her, forming an impenetrable, highly trained, protective diamond formation around her and her son. They did not march her toward the sprawling, chaotic customs queues or the public immigration desks. Instead, they guided her swiftly down a restricted corridor, bypassing the civilian population entirely. They slipped through an unmarked heavy steel security door accessed via a retinal scan, leaving the bustling airport behind. The sterile, fluorescent-lit terminal corridors gave way to a heavily secured, soundproofed VIP diplomatic suite tucked deep within the airport's administrative belly. The room was furnished with rich leather chairs and a polished mahogany conference table. Waiting beside the table stood a senior representative from the European Union Agency for Criminal Justice Cooperation, accompanied by 2 forensic data technicians. They greeted her with the utmost deference, acknowledging the incredible risk she had taken to secure the intelligence. Gwen gently set a sleepy Leo down on one of the plush sofas, handing him a tablet to keep him occupied. She turned to the conference table and unzipped the reinforced tactical bag. Her movements were precise, completely devoid of the panic Preston was currently banking on. She bypassed the banded currency and the burner phones, reaching directly for the cold, unassuming rectangle of aluminum and silicon. This was the master ledger, the physical manifestation of undeniable, irrefutable guilt that tied the Seattle operation to an expansive network of offshore money laundering. She slid the decrypted hard drive across the smooth wood. The senior official received it with a solemn nod. The technicians immediately booted up an isolated air-gapped terminal to verify the contents. The official logged the transfer, signing a heavily watermarked multi-page manifest that officially secured the chain of custody for the physical drive. The international prosecution was now armed with a smoking gun that could never be challenged in a courtroom. Preston's fake Interpol notice was not a masterstroke. It was merely the final, desperate flail of a dying king, a frantic move that only provided the authorities with further evidence of his intent to commit global extortion. The operation was complete, the data was secured, and Preston's reign was permanently over. The armored transport vehicle navigated the slick, rain-swept streets of London, pulling into the subterranean garage of an unassuming brutalist building in Mayfair. Gwen carried Leo, now fully awake and clutching a plush toy provided by a protective agent, through a series of interlocking heavy steel blast doors. The safe house was a fortress of reinforced concrete and sound-dampening foam, completely devoid of windows and stripped of any aesthetic warmth. It was a jarring, intensely welcome contrast to the suffocating velvet and crystal opulence of the Broadmoor estate. She set her son down in a brightly lit designated playroom, visible through a pane of ballistic glass, ensuring he was safe and occupied with a certified handler. Once the heavy door clicked shut, securing him, she stepped into the primary tactical briefing center. The men and women waiting for her around the stainless steel table did not view her as a fragile, emotionally unstable wife. They rose in unison, their expressions reflecting profound professional respect snapping to attention. At the head of the table stood Director Alistair Vance, the uncompromising architect of the Joint International Task Force. He poured a cup of black coffee from a thermal carafe and slid it across the metal surface toward her. She took the mug, relishing the bitter, unadulterated taste that grounded her back in reality. For 36 grueling months, she had played the role of Gwendolyn, the timid, easily manipulated former accountant who had supposedly lucked into marrying Seattle royalty. In this windowless room, however, that persona ceased to exist. She was Special Agent Genevieve Vance of the Financial Action Task Force, a premier international watchdog agency dedicated entirely to eradicating global money laundering and terrorist financing networks. Alistair was not just her director, he was her commanding officer in a silent, bloodless war against the world's most sophisticated financial predators. The encrypted hard drive she had just surrendered was the culmination of the most complex, dangerous, deep-cover assignment in the agency's history. The past 3 years had been a meticulously choreographed performance, an exhausting theater of calculated submission. Preston had always believed he chose her because she was docile, compliant, and possessed just enough basic financial literacy to manage his personal checkbook without asking complicated questions. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that her insertion into his life had been carefully engineered by a team of elite FATF behavioral profilers. They had identified his specific psychological vulnerabilities, mapping his insatiable narcissism, his pathological need to dominate, and his profound, blinding arrogance. Genevieve had simply tailored a fictional identity to fit the exact mold of the submissive woman he thought he could effortlessly control. She had smiled demurely while he aggressively berated her intelligence in front of his peers. She had cast her eyes downward when Beatrice mocked her modest middle-class upbringing. She had absorbed the toxic, relentless emotional abuse of the entire corrupt bloodline without a single flinch, weaponizing their chauvinism against them. That suffocating family arrogance had always been their fatal flaw, and her greatest tactical asset. Because they viewed her as intellectually inferior and emotionally fragile, they had effectively rendered her invisible within her own home. While Preston was busy drinking expensive scotch and loudly regaling his country club peers with heavily embellished tales of his own brilliance, Genevieve was quietly, methodically mapping the digital topography of their illegal empire. While Beatrice was agonizing over seating charts and exotic floral arrangements for lavish charity galas, Genevieve was planting microscopic digital keyloggers onto the mansion's private server racks. Every single time Preston dismissively ordered her to the basement study to fetch his preliminary tax files, he had unknowingly handed a master cryptographer and forensic accountant unrestricted physical access to the beating heart of his money laundering syndicate. The operation had required unimaginable, agonizing patience. The family did not leave glaring, obvious trails of their massive Medicare fraud. Their illicit capital was washed through a labyrinthine network of dummy corporations, randomized wire transfers, and layered offshore trusts designed to baffle traditional auditors. Genevieve had to hunt for microscopic digital breadcrumbs operating in the dead of night while her husband slept. She spent countless hours cross-referencing thousands of phantom billing codes against legitimate federal medical databases. She tracked fractional discrepancies in pharmaceutical procurement records, perfectly matching them against grossly inflated government reimbursement claims. She traced the flow of stolen taxpayer dollars as it fractured into thousands of smaller, seemingly innocuous transactions. She watched the stolen capital bounce from Delaware shell companies to Panamanian holding firms before finally coalescing back into the family's pristine Swiss accounts. She had built a devastatingly comprehensive map of their entire criminal enterprise, piecing together the indictment one agonizing line of code at a time. Maintaining the flawless facade had exacted a heavy, unseen psychological toll. Living intimately with a sociopath, sharing his bed, and forcing herself to laugh at his cruel, demeaning jokes required a level of mental compartmentalization that constantly threatened to fracture her own sanity. The hardest part had always been protecting Leo. She had to shield her innocent son from the radioactive toxicity of his own father and grandmother, while simultaneously preventing Preston from using the boy as a pawn in his power games. Every single moment spent inside that sprawling brick mansion was a terrifying high-wire act over a bottomless abyss. One misplaced word, one overly inquisitive glance at a bank statement, or one singular moment of genuine defiance could have blown her cover permanently. The men she was hunting were not just arrogant white-collar criminals. They were ruthless syndicate bosses who would not hesitate to silence a perceived threat with extreme prejudice. But the dangerous charade was finally gloriously over. Director Vance tapped the screen of his secure tabletop terminal, pulling up a live encrypted video feed of the coordinated FBI raids currently dismantling the Seattle operation. He confirmed that the master decryption keys Genevieve provided had successfully unlocked the primary offshore vaults, securing the raw financial data. The federal indictments generated from her intelligence were not just airtight. They formed an absolute titanium vault. There was no clever legal maneuvering, no expensive corporate defense strategy, and no amount of bribed municipal officials that could save Preston Gregory or Beatrice now. The evidence was completely irrefutable, tracking every stolen federal cent directly back to their personal digital signatures. Genevieve took a slow, deep breath, feeling the last lingering remnants of the weak, terrified wife wash away forever. She set the coffee mug down on the steel table, rolled her shoulders back, and looked at the tactical map displaying the ruined empire. The ghost had materialized, the trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force, and the apex predators were finally nothing more than caged prey. The heavy silence of the subterranean bunker was abruptly punctured by the sharp, trilling chirp of a customized satellite phone. Gwen did not hesitate. The device resting beside her empty coffee mug flashed a blinding green indicator light, signaling an incoming, heavily encrypted transmission utilizing a military-grade routing protocol. She tapped the reinforced screen, raising the device to her ear with practiced fluidity. The voice transmitting through the secure channel was exhausted, carrying the distinct, gravelly rasp of a man who had not slept in 3 consecutive days. Yet beneath the severe fatigue, it vibrated with an undeniable undercurrent of profound relief. It was Jamal. To the outside world, the media, and the high society circles of the Pacific Northwest, Jamal was merely Preston's quiet, unassuming brother-in-law. He was the brilliant orthopedic surgeon married to the venomous, hyper-materialistic Delilah. To the Broadmoor syndicate, he was little more than a useful idiot, a highly prestigious medical credential they paraded at charity galas to legitimize their sprawling healthcare empire. But to Special Agent Genevieve Vance, Jamal was the crucial, indispensable missing link. He was her inside man. "It is done." General Jamal breathed into the receiver, using her actual operational name for the very first time in 24 agonizing months. His treacherous journey into the heart of the family's darkness had begun by sheer horrifying accident. 2 years prior, while reviewing routine post-operative charts during a late-night shift, Jamal had noticed glaring, inexplicable anomalies. Patients he had never physically examined, highly complex spinal fusions that had never occurred, and extensive rehabilitation therapies that were entirely fictional were suddenly bearing his forged electronic signature. The clinic was systematically billing the federal government for phantom surgeries, utilizing the stolen identities of deceased or comatose patients to bleed the Medicare system dry. The scale of the deception was industrial. Jamal possessed the pristine clinical expertise to recognize the blatant medical impossibilities, but he severely lacked the high-level financial access required to trace the stolen capital. If he had simply gone to the medical board or the local authorities with unverified suspicions, Preston's army of vicious corporate lawyers would have instantly buried him in defamation lawsuits. They would have revoked his medical license and painted him as a disgruntled, mentally unstable physician seeking attention. He needed a financial counterpart. He needed someone who could successfully map the money laundering labyrinth. He found that silent, deadly partner in the woman everyone else dismissed as the meek, subservient accountant. Their clandestine partnership had been an absolute masterclass in covert tradecraft, executed flawlessly right under the arrogant noses of the entire corrupt bloodline. During mandatory Sunday dinners, while Beatrice aggressively criticized the wine selection and Delilah loudly bragged about her latest European shopping spree, Jamal and Gwen would exchange innocuous pleasantries. Underneath the heavy mahogany dining table, Jamal would silently slip micro-memory cards containing thousands of fraudulent clinical billing codes into Gwen's purse. They communicated through dead drops at the local country club, utilizing a heavily modified messaging application disguised as a generic mobile puzzle game to synchronize their data dumps. Jamal provided the phantom medical records. Gwen tracked the corresponding dirty money to the offshore accounts. Together, they forged the dual-edged sword that ultimately decapitated the syndicate. Now standing safely inside the London facility, Gwen listened as her brother-in-law delivered his final devastating situation report. He had pulled the trigger exactly 30 minutes after the tactical teams breached the Broadmoor estate, his tone turning remarkably clinical, completely devoid of any lingering familial attachment. He had calmly walked into the sprawling master bedroom he shared with Delilah, bypassed her hysterical, unhinged shrieking about the federal agents swarming their manicured lawn, and handed her a thick manila folder. It was not a comforting embrace to soothe her panic. It was a stack of expedited, ironclad divorce papers. Jamal had not stopped at simply dissolving his toxic, loveless marriage. He had spent the entire previous year secretly funneling his own, legitimately earned surgical income into a blind trust, securing the most ruthless family law litigators on the West Coast. Leveraging the massive mountain of evidence, proving Delilah's active, enthusiastic complicity in the criminal enterprise, the judge had granted an emergency ex parte custody order. Jamal informed Gwen that his daughters were already safely relocated to a secure, undisclosed property, legally and physically shielded from the impending radioactive fallout of the family's total collapse. Delilah had been permanently stripped of all parental rights before she even understood the catastrophic scope of her ruin. Furthermore, Jamal had just departed the state medical board headquarters. He had dropped off a secondary highly explosive dossier packed with the forged clinical records and cross-referenced billing sheets. He had permanently severed the syndicate's ability to ever practice, manage, or bill for medicine in the United States again. The board was already moving to revoke licenses across their entire network of clinics. "She screamed that I was a traitor," Jamal said, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his lips, echoing through the encrypted connection. "She actually believed that marrying into their family meant I surrendered my conscience. I told her the only thing I was betraying was a cartel." Gwen felt a deep, resonant surge of respect for the surgeon. He had risked his entire career, his personal freedom, and his life to do what was legally and morally right, deliberately tearing down his own household to stop the bleeding. "You performed flawlessly," Jamal Gwen replied, her voice echoing with professional authority and genuine, profound gratitude. "Your daughters are completely safe. The data is secured. The task force has everything they need to proceed with the indictments. You are out of the blast zone." The line clicked dead, leaving a profound, triumphant silence in its wake. The internal sabotage was absolute and complete. The mighty, untouchable medical dynasty had not just been besieged by outside federal forces, it had been meticulously, brutally eviscerated from the inside by the very individuals they had considered too weak and insignificant to notice their crimes. The pristine illusion of control inside Elias Thorne's Bellevue security bunker shattered the moment Preston's encrypted burner phone chimed with a devastating automated alert. The Interpol red notice his supposed masterstroke had been summarily cancelled, bypassed, overridden by a higher authority. Preston stared at the sterile text message, the blood draining from his face as the terrifying reality crystallized. Gwen had not been detained. She had not been cornered. She was protected. Before he could fully process the collapse of his international trap, Gregory barged into the windowless conference room, his usual aristocratic composure entirely obliterated. The older man's bespoke tie was loosened, his breathing ragged. He had just received word from his last remaining mole inside the state medical board. Jamal had surrendered everything. The phantom billing codes, the forged surgical logs, the patient identity matrices. It was all in federal custody. The domestic fraud case was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an inescapable impending avalanche. There was no legal maneuvering left. No judge to bribe, no politician to extort. The broad federal indictments were already being unsealed. Preston and Gregory exchanged a singular, chilling look of mutual comprehension. Survival required immediate, ruthless pragmatism. The Broadmoor estate was lost. The clinics were gone. And Beatrice, the imperious matriarch who was currently trapped inside the raided mansion surrounded by federal agents and news crews, was dead weight. To attempt a rescue or coordinate a joint extraction would guarantee their capture. She was highly visible, hysterical, and constantly monitored. Without a word of debate, the father and son executed the coldest calculation of their lives. They would leave her behind. She would serve as the ultimate tragic decoy, absorbing the media frenzy and the initial brunt of the FBI's interrogation tactics while they engineered their disappearance. Preston abandoned Thorne in the conference room without a backward glance, shoving past the disgraced intelligence officer and sprinting for the subterranean parking garage. He bypassed his recognizable luxury sedans, moving straight for a dusty, unregistered black SUV, kept explicitly for untraceable emergencies. Gregory took the wheel, his hands trembling slightly as he ignited the engine. Tires screeched against the slick concrete as they tore out of the garage, launching into the dismal, rain-soaked Seattle afternoon. Their destination was a private, unlisted airfield located 40 miles east of the city, a discreet strip of tarmac favored by corporate executives and individuals requiring absolute anonymity. As Gregory forcefully navigated the heavy commuter traffic swerving erratically between lanes, Preston braced himself in the passenger seat, booting up a clean, heavily encrypted tablet. The domestic bank accounts were frozen. The offshore holding companies tied to the clinics were already being systematically dismantled by the Joint Task Force. They had one single, heavily guarded lifeline left. Deep within the digital vaults of a notoriously opaque Cayman Islands financial institution, insulated by a labyrinthine matrix of fake corporate identities, phantom shareholders, and randomized alphanumeric routing codes, sat $50 million in untethered capital. It was the ultimate doomsday fund, amassed over a decade of skimming off the very top of their illicit empire, completely severed from the Broadmoor syndicate's primary ledgers. Preston's fingers flew across the glass screen, inputting a staggering sequence of biometric verifications, rotating authentication tokens, and complex cryptographic passkeys. He navigated through the layered security protocols of the offshore banking portal, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the blast of the SUV's air conditioning. Through a separate encrypted messaging application, he was simultaneously negotiating with a black market aviation broker. He needed a long-range Gulfstream-fueled, prepped and cleared for immediate takeoff. The destination was a cooperative jurisdiction in the Middle East, a nation with highly favorable banking privacy laws, and crucially, no standing extradition treaty with the United States. The broker's demands were exorbitant and non-negotiable. $2 million transferred immediately into an escrow account, or the aircraft would remain chained to the tarmac. The pilot required absolute financial confirmation before spinning up the turbines. Preston typed a furious confirmation, switching back to the Cayman banking portal. The dark interface loaded, displaying the massive $50 million balance. It was a digital fortune enough to purchase new identities, elite security details, and a lifetime of untouchable luxury in exile. "How far are we?" Preston barked, his eyes glued to the illuminated screen as he initiated the international wire transfer protocol. He inputted the broker's routing numbers with frantic precision. 20 minutes out, Gregory replied. His voice strained as he aggressively passed a slow-moving transport truck, tires slipping dangerously on the wet asphalt. The perimeter gate code is still active. Just get the damn money moved. The feds will be tracking our phones any minute. We have to ditch these devices before we board. Preston tapped the final execution command. The tablet screen flashed, transitioning from the transfer terminal to a stark, minimalist loading interface. A small, stylized circular icon appeared in the center of the display, spinning in a steady, hypnotic rhythm beneath the word processing. Preston exhaled a sharp, jagged breath, waiting for the instantaneous confirmation screen. Offshore VIP routing protocols were designed to bypass standard clearinghouse delays. The transaction should have executed in milliseconds, but the screen did not shift. The blue circle continued its endless fluid rotation. 10 seconds passed, then 20. A cold, creeping dread began to pool in the pit of Preston's stomach. He violently tapped the screen, attempting to refresh the portal. The interface blinked, reloaded, and presented the exact same spinning icon. Processing. "What's the delay?" Gregory demanded, glancing nervously at the dashboard clock, the wail of a distant police siren echoing through the rain-battered windows. "Tell them to start the auxiliary engines. We don't have time to wait." "It's hanging!" Preston hissed, his thumb jabbing the refresh command with escalating aggression. "The transfer is hanging on the host server." Panic, raw and paralyzing, finally pierced Preston's arrogant armor. This account was invisible. It was completely insulated from the clinic's digital infrastructure. There was absolutely no way the federal task force could have traced the dummy corporations to the Cayman vault this quickly. It was mathematically impossible. Yet the small mocking circle continued to spin, a digital purgatory trapping his salvation. Through the windshield, the dark silhouette of the private airfield's perimeter fence materialized through the mist. Gregory punched the accelerator, tearing down the access road toward the main security gate. In the distance, through the heavy downpour, they could see the sleek, aerodynamic shape of the Gulf Stream, parked on the wet tarmac, a boarding staircase lowered and waiting. Preston's encrypted messaging app chimed harshly. It was the aviation broker. A single ruthless sentence. "Funds not received. Flight aborted." Preston stared at this banking portal. The spinning icon froze. The word processing dissolved, replaced by a glaring blood-red security banner that blanketed the entire display. The message was devastatingly brief. "Account frozen. FATF International Seizure Order. Authority Agent G. Vance." The $50 million had not simply vanished. It had been actively intercepted, frozen by the very woman he thought he had crushed. The ultimate lifeline was severed, leaving them accelerating toward an empty runway with absolutely nowhere left to run. The glaring red pixels of the seizure notice reflected in Preston's wide, bloodshot eyes. He completely refused to accept the finality of the digital death sentence. With a guttural, feral roar, he hurled the encrypted tablet against the reinforced dashboard and blindly grabbed the heavy, iridium-cased satellite phone from the center console. Gregory yanked the steering wheel, sending the armored town car hydroplaning around a sharp bend. The vehicle's heavy chassis protested, tires violently kicking up sheets of muddy water as they tore down the final stretch of the desolate access road. The private jet was less than a mile away, its anti-collision lights strobing rhythmically through the torrential downpour, an agonizingly close phantom of salvation that remained firmly out of reach without the extortionate boarding fee. Preston slammed his thumb against the keypad, bypassing standard international dialing codes and routing his signal directly into the subterranean communications hub of their Cayman Islands financial fortress. He listened to the hollow metallic clicks of the secure relays engaging across the hemisphere, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together. Every passing microsecond felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The heavy, restrictive plastic of the GPS monitor, clamped to his ankle, seemed to pulse with a phantom heat, a constant reminder of his tethered reality. A voice finally answered the line. It was crisp, unhurried, and infuriatingly polite. The offshore banker spoke with a clipped transatlantic accent that conveyed absolute bureaucratic detachment, completely insulated from the chaotic ruin collapsing around his client. Preston did not allow the man to finish his formal greeting. He unleashed a toxic torrent of demands, his voice raw and echoing off the confined, sound-dampened interior of the speeding car. He ordered the immediate, unconditional manual release of the $50 million offshore reserve directly to the aviation broker's shadow escrow account. The banker paused, The ensuing silence on the satellite link was colder than the freezing Seattle rain battering the windshield. He informed Preston in the detached tone of a concierge declining a late checkout that a secondary security override had been triggered within the core ledger architecture. The funds were completely immobilized. The host servers had been locked down by an unprecedented multinational directive. Preston screamed into the receiver, spittle flying across the plush leather upholstery. He threatened the banker with complete financial ruin, citing decades of illicit loyalty and the bank's own deep criminal complicity in laundering the Broadmoor syndicate's capital. He demanded they physically sever the hard lines to the external web, isolate the internal network from global regulators, and force the transfer through local unregulated clearinghouses. The banker remained entirely unmoved by the violent tirade. He cited regulatory compliance statutes, international banking treaties, and rigid protocol mandates with robotic, unwavering precision. The financial institution was actively shielding itself from the massive blast radius of the family's implosion. They were aggressively cutting their losses, and Preston was the radioactive liability they were immediately shedding. In the driver's seat, Gregory began to spectacularly unravel. The older man's pristine, untouchable facade, maintained for decades through ruthless intimidation and obscene wealth, finally fractured completely. His knuckles were bone white against the leather steering wheel, his manicured hands trembling violently. He started to hyperventilate, his chest heaving with short, ragged gasps that rapidly fogged the windshield glass. The rhythmic, pulsing green light of his own ankle monitor caught his peripheral vision, amplifying his terror. He frantically calculated the response time of the federal marshals. The GPS devices were actively broadcasting their exact speed, elevation, and trajectory to a command center. They were painting a glowing digital target on their backs, leading the authorities straight down the unlisted airstrip. Gregory's voice cracked into a high-pitched, panicked wheeze, frantically warning his son that the tactical interception teams were likely already vectoring toward the tarmac to cut off their escape. Preston entirely ignored his father's escalating psychological breakdown. He gripped the satellite phone tight enough to threaten the structural integrity of the casing. He possessed one final ultimate trump card. When he had initially structured the Cayman accounts years ago, he inherently distrusted the bankers. He had anticipated the possibility of external interference and engineered a ghost protocol. It was an apex override designed to circumvent both the bank's internal compliance officers and any international freeze orders. It relied on a highly classified, multi-tier biometric handshake that he firmly believed only he controlled. He barked a sharp, authoritative command to the banker, ordering him to bypass the standard graphical interface access, the terminal root directory, and prepare the system for a manual vocal authorization. The banker hesitated clearly, uncomfortable stepping outside the mandated compliance parameters, then reluctantly complied. The sound of rapid, heavy typing echoed over the secure line. Preston leaned close to the receiver's microphone and recited a complex, randomized alphanumeric sequence. He followed it immediately with a highly specific voice-print-analyzed passphrase, utilizing a specific cadence and pitch that the algorithms demanded. This was the master key that theoretically unlocked the deepest, most heavily encrypted vault in the Caribbean. He snatched the discarded tablet from the floorboard, brushing off a smudge of dirt. The screen flickered wildly. The stark red FATF seizure banner momentarily dissolved as the raw command line interface ripped through the network's exterior digital defenses. Preston's heart hammered a frantic, victorious rhythm against his ribs. He had successfully bypassed the federal lock. The $50 million materialized on the screen once more, the digital digits glowing in stark, beautiful white against the black background. He quickly re-entered the aviation broker's intricate routing numbers, his fingers flying across the glass with desperate laser-focused precision. The transaction progress bar appeared, a thin blue line racing across the display toward completion. Gregory slammed the brakes, bringing the heavy town car to a violent skidding halt just outside the chain-link perimeter gate of the airfield. Through the rain, the Gulfstream idled on the runway, its pilot waiting for the ultimate green light to drop the stairs. The blue line on the tablet hit 99%. Preston held his breath, his eyes wide, anticipating the final confirmation screen, the singular digital key that would secure their international freedom. The screen suddenly froze. The progress bar halted entirely. A harsh, dissonant error tone erupted from the tablet's tiny internal speakers. The terminal interface shattered, replaced by a cascading wall of chaotic, indecipherable error codes. The funds had not cleared. The transfer was completely paralyzed in the digital ether. The account had not just been frozen by a standard federal warrant. The fundamental foundational architecture of the ledger had been actively rewritten from the inside. The biometric override, the ultimate failsafe Preston had relied upon for his very survival, had been systematically deactivated and locked out by an administrator with higher security clearance than the creator. The $50 million remained trapped in the void, completely untouchable, leaving the two men isolated in a stalled car, staring at the waiting jet as the wail of approaching federal sirens began to cut through the heavy, relentless rain. Half a world away from the rain-lashed Seattle tarmac, the subterranean London Tactical Center hummed with the quiet, predatory energy of a digital war room. The environment was kept deliberately frigid, a necessary precaution to prevent the towering banks of high-powered servers from overheating as they processed terabytes of encrypted global financial data. Genevieve Vance sat perfectly still at the epicenter of a massive curved workstation, surrounded by a half-dozen of the Financial Action Task Force's most lethal cyber forensic analysts. The glow from 6 interconnected ultra-high-definition monitors bathed her face in a stark pale light, reflecting strings of raw alphanumeric data. On her primary center screen, a progress bar had frozen at exactly 99%. It was a live, synchronized mirror of the exact interface currently driving her husband to the brink of insanity inside his armored vehicle. She watched the cascading wall of fatal error codes flood Preston's remote terminal, her expression remaining entirely impassive, devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. The foundation of this flawless digital ambush had been laid many months ago, built entirely upon the bedrock of Preston's colossal, blinding arrogance. He had always believed his cryptographic firewalls were impenetrable, placing absolute faith in his offshore shell companies, his elite corporate attorneys, and his own bespoke biometric safeguards to indefinitely shield his ultimate slush fund. What he completely failed to comprehend was the severe vulnerability of his immediate physical environment. He had routinely executed highly sensitive administrative logins to his offshore accounts while sitting comfortably in his sprawling home office, carelessly connected to the Broadmoor estate's private, seemingly secure Wi-Fi network. He assumed the domestic router, protected by standard enterprise-grade encryption, was an impenetrable fortress. He never once suspected that his meek, submissive wife, the woman he treated as a glorified secretary, had physically spliced a microscopic, military-grade hardware packet sniffer directly into the primary fiber optic line feeding the entire mansion. Through that tiny, completely undetected hardware bridge, Genevieve had spent a year quietly and methodically siphoning every single encrypted data packet that left his personal devices. The FATF analysts in London did not need to brute force crack the Cayman Bank's formidable external defenses. Genevieve had simply stolen the master keys from the inside. With the help of the agency's behavioral algorithms, she had captured the precise, unique cadence of his vocal passwords, isolating the exact pitch timbre and acoustic signature he used for telephone banking. She had meticulously mapped the unique pressure metrics, rhythm, and micro-hesitations of his physical keystrokes on his encrypted tablet. She had even successfully cloned the digital hash of his biometric thumbprint from the shattered remnants of a discarded smartphone screen. When Preston had frantically initiated the emergency override protocol in the speeding town car, desperately screaming his passphrases into the satellite phone, he was not communicating directly with his offshore bankers. He was communicating with a heavily disguised F-controlled proxy server routed straight to Genevieve's terminal in Mayfair. She had allowed him to input his ultimate master credentials, effectively verifying his identity and satisfying the banking institution's strictest security requirements before instantly stripping him of all administrative privileges. She had locked him inside a digital cage of his own making. With Preston permanently locked out of the host network and his devices rendered useless, Genevieve initiated the FATF's proprietary clawback protocol. It was a highly classified, internationally sanctioned financial maneuver designed specifically to retrieve illicit capital hidden in notorious non-extradition jurisdictions before the targets could physically launder the cash or flee the country. Her hands moved across the mechanical keyboard with blistering practice speed, executing the final sequence of authorization commands. The cyber experts flanking her furiously monitored the global routing nodes, deploying active countermeasures to ensure the Cayman firewall remained entirely suppressed. The offshore bank's automated compliance algorithms momentarily attempted to flag the massive, uncharacteristic outbound wire transfer. Warning indicators flared across Genevieve's secondary monitors. Without missing a beat, she deployed the mirrored biometric authorizations, digitally mimicking Preston's exact signature and voice print to force approve the release of the capital. The offshore bank's security architecture, recognizing the credentials as absolute and indisputable, immediately stood down, lowering its defenses. The $50 million was violently unmoored from the Caribbean vault. Genevieve watched the raw data stream across her monitors as the staggering sum of capital fractured into dozens of different secure routing channels, cleanly bypassing the black market aviation broker's escrow account entirely. She was not simply seizing the money for the federal government's general treasury, she was executing a highly targeted, legally binding instantaneous restitution order. She funneled the massive wave of stolen cash through a secure international clearinghouse based in Geneva, systematically scrubbing the corporate anonymizers and tagging the funds with a permanent, irrevocable federal forfeiture marker. The money surged back across the Atlantic, re-entering the United States financial system with blinding, untraceable speed. Genevieve struck the enter key one final time, locking the destination coordinates and executing the terminal command. The capital slammed into a highly fortified, federally administered victim compensation trust. This was an airtight, legally untouchable account established specifically by the Department of Justice to hold restitution funds for the thousands of elderly patients and vulnerable citizens whose identities and medical records the family had ruthlessly exploited for years. The digital ledger on her primary screen updated with a sharp, satisfying chime, confirming the $50 million was irrevocably locked inside the federal trust. There would be no escape flights, no luxury exile in the Middle East, and no expensive legal defense funds for the Broadmoor syndicate. The staggering wealth they had extracted through years of systematic predatory fraud had been surgically reclaimed and permanently repurposed for their victims. Genevieve leaned back in her ergonomic chair, taking a slow sip of her cold coffee, the harsh glare of the monitors reflecting the absolute finality of the successful transfer. Through the relentless driving deluge of the Pacific Northwest storm, the stolen black SUV smashed through the automated security barrier of the auxiliary access road at Boeing Field. The fiberglass gate splintered violently across the hood, scattering debris into the muddy trenches lining the perimeter. The heavy vehicle fishtailed wildly across the slick oil-stained concrete, its suspension groaning in harsh metallic protest as Gregory fought to regain control over the steering column. They skidded onto the expansive floodlit expanse of the private tarmac, the windshield wipers thrashing frantically against the torrential downpour. They're positioned at the far end of the primary runway and bathed in the stark sodium vapor glare of the towering security floodlights sat the sleek silver chassis of the chartered Gulfstream. Its twin turbines were already fully spooled up, emitting a high-pitched, bone-rattling whine that vibrated intensely through the reinforced frame of the SUV. The boarding stairs were fully deployed, a welcoming illuminated metallic ramp leading directly up to their salvation. Preston practically kicked the heavy passenger door open before the vehicle had even come to a complete shuddering halt. He vaulted out into the freezing rain, the heavy, useless satellite phone clutched in his hand like a sacred talisman. He was completely oblivious to the bitter cold instantly soaking through his bespoke Italian suit, his vision narrowed to a tunnel-like focus on the aircraft door. He sprinted across the flooded tarmac, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping and splashing violently through deep, icy puddles that reflected the strobing anti-collision lights of the jet. Gregory stumbled out of the driver's side a moment later, his lungs burning with sudden sharp agony. His chest heaved with ragged, desperate gasps as he tried to keep pace with his son. The older man's pristine, aristocratic composure was entirely eradicated, replaced by the frantic, undignified scramble of a cornered, hunted animal. The heavy, restrictive plastic of the federal GPS monitor clamped tightly to his ankle felt like an iron shackle dragging him down with every uneven step. The deafening mechanical roar of the jet engines swallowed the approaching wail of the distant police sirens, creating a false, isolating bubble of temporary security around the two fleeing men. Preston reached the base of the boarding stairs, his hand grabbing the freezing cold aluminum handrail with a vice-like grip. He took the metal steps two at a time, his chest swelling with a toxic, triumphant surge of adrenaline. They were mere seconds away from vanishing into international airspace, seconds away from leaving the shattered, smoking ruins of the Broadmoor syndicate behind. He envisioned the luxurious, untouchable exile awaiting them in a cooperative jurisdiction where American extradition warrants held absolutely zero legal weight. He had beaten the brilliant behavioral profilers, bypassed the federal dragnet, and outsmarted the international banking regulators. He was exactly 3 steps away from the open cabin door when the massive aircraft suddenly shuddered beneath his feet. The deafening, high-pitched scream of the dual turbines did not pitch up for an aggressive taxi protocol. Instead, the massive engines emitted a deep, resonant mechanical groan. The intense, vibrating roar rapidly decelerated, cycling down into a low, dying, pathetic whine. The red and white anti-collision strobes stopped their frantic flashing, plunging the immediate area into heavy shadows. The sudden, unnatural quiet that washed over the rain-swept tarmac was infinitely more terrifying than the deafening noise had been. Preston froze on the grooved metal steps, his knuckles turning stark white against the handrail. The heavy cabin door swung fully open, and the chief pilot stepped into the illuminated entryway, a grim, uncompromising expression etched deeply across his weathered face. He was not smiling. He was not extending a hand to greet his elite VIP passengers. He was wearing a heavy aviation communication headset, his hand pressing the plastic earpiece tightly against his skull as he listened to a continuous, urgent transmission. The pilot looked down at Preston, slowly shaking his head with absolute crushing finality. The control tower had just locked down the entire regional airspace. Federal Aviation Administration ground stops were instantly active across all commercial and private strips. Air traffic control had formally and aggressively revoked their flight clearance under direct overriding orders from the United States Department of Justice. The aircraft was legally paralyzed on the concrete. Preston's mind violently and utterly rejected the information. He lunged up the final 3 stairs, shoving his waterlogged, deactivated satellite phone directly toward the pilot's face. The screen was still frozen on the fatal corrupted error codes generated by the FATF clawback protocol, but Preston was entirely detached from reality. He screamed over the dying whine of the cooling turbines, his voice cracking with unhinged feral panic. He demanded the crew immediately seal the door, ignore the tower, and initiate an unauthorized blind takeoff. He promised to wire $10 million, then $20 million. He shouted, his face contorted in a mask of pure desperation, that he would instantly double the original exorbitant flight fee. He swore he would bypass the shadow escrow account entirely and transfer the massive capital directly into the pilot's personal offshore accounts the very second they reached cruising altitude. He waved the dead, useless piece of encrypted plastic and circuitry like a loaded weapon, his spittle flying into the pilot's crisp, white uniform. Gregory reached the bottom of the stairs, his knees finally giving out. He collapsed onto the wet tarmac, clutching his chest as he stared up through the driving rain at his completely unraveling son. The older man understood the brutal, inescapable truth that Preston could not accept. The offshore money was gone. The plane was a dead, grounded, useless piece of metal. The trap had not just closed, it had completely pulverized them. The pilot did not speak a single word in response to the frantic multimillion-dollar bribes. He simply looked at Preston with a mixture of professional disgust and profound pity. The pilot took a deliberate step backward into the dry warmth of the cabin and pulled a heavy mechanical lever. The hydraulic gears of the boarding door began to engage, emitting a loud hiss, as the staircase slowly began to retract and fold upward, closing shut right in Preston's face. The ultimate escape hatch was systematically sealing itself off, physically pushing Preston backward down the steps. He pounded his bare fists against the retracting metal exterior, his manic broken screams dissolving entirely into the relentless drone of the Seattle storm, as a convoy of armored federal vehicles breached the airfield gates, their flashing blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. The heavy reinforced doors of the tactical Bearcats swung open before the armored vehicles even groaned to a complete shuddering halt on the flooded runway. Dozens of federal agents in full tactical gear poured out onto the slick, oil-stained concrete, their assault rifles raised and laser sights cutting through the relentless downpour. The flashing strobes of the approaching cavalcade painted the entire airstrip in a chaotic, disorienting wash of crimson and cobalt. The commanding officer's voice boomed over a heavy bullhorn, the amplified commands to surrender slicing through the sound of the Seattle storm and the fading, pathetic whine of the grounded jet engines. At the base of the retracted aluminum boarding stairs, Gregory Broadmoor was already face down on the freezing tarmac. The patriarch of the syndicate made no attempt to run, hide, or fight. He simply laid his cheek against the wet concrete, his manicured hands interlaced behind his head, offering zero resistance as two heavily armed operatives descended upon him. The metallic ratcheting of zip ties binding his wrists echoed with grim finality, signaling the absolute unceremonious death of a criminal dynasty that had spanned 4 decades. Preston stood completely paralyzed near the fuselage of the sealed aircraft, ignoring the blinding spotlights pinning him against the silver hull of the Gulfstream. The federal agents were rapidly closing the perimeter, screaming at him to drop to his knees and show his hands, but the external world had effectively ceased to exist for him. His reality had shrunk entirely to the dimensions of the waterproof military-grade tablet he had snatched back from the town car during his initial frantic sprint. The device was still locked in a frozen loop of fatal errors, displaying a cascading waterfall of dissonant code that signaled the FATF seizure. His brain vehemently rejected the physical reality of the tactical teams swarming his father. He believed with the pathological delusion of a man who had never lost a negotiation in his life that money could still freeze time. If he could just access the secondary ledger, if he could just bypass the federal banner and display the raw, undeniable balance to the commanding officer, he could buy his way out. He could bribe the entire strike team. He could purchase the runway. He was a Broadmoor, and his wealth was a fundamental law of physics. Desperate, his thumbs hammered against the reinforced glass of the screen, executing a brute force manual reboot of the offshore banking application. He bypassed the corrupted graphical interface, entirely launching a hidden command line terminal he had programmed for emergency deep state access. He ignored the tactical operative advancing on him, the barrel of a rifle leveled directly at his chest. He was hyperventilating his breath, fogging the damp screen as he desperately typed in a series of highly classified override commands. The dark screen flickered. The chaotic error codes dissolved, replaced by the stark, minimalist login portal of the Cayman Shadow server. Preston let out a ragged, triumphant gasp that sounded like a sob. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner, his heart hammering against his ribs with enough force to crack bone. The scanner pulsed with a green laser, reading his fingerprint through the rainwater. An agonizing, spinning loading icon appeared. The tactical operative was now less than 10 feet away, shouting a final warning for Preston to drop the device and interlace his fingers. Preston did not even blink. He stared at the spinning icon, waiting for his salvation. He waited for the $50 million to populate the screen. He waited for the digital proof of his supremacy to validate his entire existence and shield him from the consequences of his actions. The interface flashed. The loading icon vanished. The raw numerical data populated the center of the display in high-contrast white font. But the numbers did not arrange themselves into the magnificent sprawling string of digits he expected. There was no 50 million. The balance displayed on the deepest, most heavily encrypted ledger in his financial empire was a stark, singular character. $0. Preston's lungs completely seized. The air was physically driven from his chest. He tapped the screen frantically, his wet fingers leaving smudges across the glass. Convinced it was a rendering error, a visual glitch caused by satellite latency. He forcefully refreshed the encrypted banking application again and again, his fingernails audibly clicking against the heavy display. The screen blinked, communicating with the offshore host, and instantly redrew the exact same devastating figure, $0. His eyes darted wildly across the digital ledger, hunting for the transaction history, searching for any indication of a federal freeze or a pending bureaucratic hold. The primary ledger was completely empty, scrubbed clean down to the root architecture. But beneath the zero balance, hovering in the small standardized text field, normally reserved for mundane wire transfer memos, a single transaction note appeared on his screen. It had been manually inputted by the administrator who executed the total withdrawal. It read, "For your Uber ride, Gwen." The words burned themselves into Preston's retinas. The tablet slipped from his suddenly numb, nerveless fingers, tumbling to the wet concrete and shattering the corner of the casing. The psychological devastation hit Preston simultaneously as the realization set in. It was an internal, catastrophic collapse that mirrored the physical destruction of his father currently happening on the tarmac. It was not the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was not the international banking regulators. It was not a brilliant anonymous cyber analyst working for a global task force. It was Gwen, the quiet, unassuming woman he had married for appearances. The woman he had relentlessly belittled, marginalized, and treated as a decorative, expendable asset. The woman he had looked directly in the eyes and called a worthless failure just hours ago. He had built a titanium fortress to protect his empire from the world's most dangerous predators, completely blind to the fact that he had handed the keys to the architect of his demise. Gwen had not just reported them. She had not simply turned state's evidence or cooperated with the authorities. The woman he called a worthless failure just systematically dismantled his entire bloodline's empire from the inside out. She had mapped his keystrokes, stolen his biometrics, hijacked his offshore network, and legally routed his ultimate safety net away forever. She had waited for the exact moment of his maximum desperation to pull the final fatal thread. The mockery of the memo echoed in his mind with deafening volume. He was standing in the freezing rain, his private jet sealed shut, his armored car abandoned, stripped of every single cent he had ever possessed. He was utterly stranded, reduced to the exact level of powerlessness he had gleefully inflicted upon thousands of victims. The tactical operative closed the final distance, grabbing Preston by the shoulder and spinning him around. Preston offered absolutely no physical resistance. His knees buckled slightly as the heavy, cold metal of the handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, biting into his skin. He did not feel the freezing rain soaking through his expensive clothes, nor did he hear his father weeping from the back of the armored transport vehicle. As the federal agents forcefully marched him across the flooded tarmac toward the flashing lights of a waiting convoy, Preston could only stare blankly into the darkness, completely destroyed by the sudden terrifying realization that he had engineered his own absolute ruin. The shattered tablet lay submerged in a widening puddle of jet fuel and rainwater, its cracked screen still projecting the damning evidence of Gwen's ultimate coup. Before Preston could even begin to process the asphyxiating reality of his newly minted destitution, the primary access gates of the airfield were entirely obliterated. The initial tactical vanguard that had secured the immediate perimeter was instantly eclipsed by the arrival of the main federal strike force. A phalanx of unlisted, heavily armored black SUVs roared onto the tarmac, their massive engines drowning out the Seattle tempest. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized aggression, boxing in the grounded Gulf Stream and severing any theoretical avenues of escape. The vehicle doors flew open, while the heavy tires were still violently skidding across the slick concrete. A deluge of United States Marshals and FBI special agents swarmed the runway, their tactical boots splashing heavily through the standing water. Weapons were drawn and leveled with lethal intent. The blinding phosphorescent glare of weapon-mounted flashlights cut through the torrential downpour, painting chaotic beams of white light across the silver fuselage of the aircraft and the two men standing beneath it. Overlapping deafening commands echoed off the aluminum hull, ordering total and immediate compliance. Preston remained anchored to the tarmac, his mind short-circuiting between the zero balance in his offshore ledger and the overwhelming sensory assault of the federal raid. He had no time to brace himself. Two massive marshals collided with him, their momentum driving the breath completely from his lungs. The physical impact was jarring, devoid of the deferential caution law enforcement usually reserved for men of his tax bracket. They seized him by the soaked shoulders of his bespoke Italian suit and aggressively drove him face-first into the freezing exterior of the jet. The brutal impact against the curved metal scraped the skin from his cheekbone, tasting of aviation fuel and copper. A few yards away, Gregory suffered an identical fate. The aging patriarch, a man who had spent 4 decades manipulating senators and intimidating judges from the plush confines of mahogany boardrooms, was hauled up from the wet concrete. Agents slammed him roughly against the aircraft's landing gear strut. Gregory let out a sharp, undignified yelp as his legs gave way, his physical frailty entirely exposed under the harsh tactical lighting. The heavy, restrictive GPS monitor clamped to his ankle was violently yanked and inspected, a glaring testament to his immediate violation of federal mandates. Preston Broadmoor, a senior FBI agent, barked, pressing his forearm tightly against the back of Preston's neck to keep him pinned against the freezing fuselage. The agent's voice was laced with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You are under arrest for the direct violation of your federal bail conditions, conspiracy to flee the jurisdiction of the United States, and multiple counts of wire fraud." The Miranda rights were recited rapidly, an obligatory legal cadence shouted over the roar of the storm, rather than a courtesy. Preston's wrists were wrenched behind his back with agonizing force. The ratcheting bite of heavy-duty double-locking steel handcuffs clamped down on his bones, completely cutting off the circulation to his hands. This was not the white-collar gentleman's arrest his elite attorneys had previously negotiated. There was no scheduled surrender at a discreet side entrance of a downtown courthouse. This was a raw, kinetic takedown designed to neutralize a high-flight risk syndicate attempting a desperate international escape. To ensure neither man possessed concealed weapons, encrypted hardware, or cyanide, the agents initiated a deeply degrading field search right there on the flooded tarmac. An operative roughly grabbed the collar of Preston's waterlogged $10,000 tailored wool jacket. With a sharp, unsympathetic yank, the agent peeled the heavy garment off Preston's shoulders, binding his arms awkwardly in the process, before tossing the ruined luxury item carelessly onto the grease-stained concrete. The expensive fabric settled into a muddy puddle, immediately trampled by the heavy combat boots of the surrounding strike team. Gregory was stripped of his custom cashmere overcoat with equal prejudice. The older man was left shivering violently in a sheer, transparently wet dress shirt, his immaculate facade completely dismantled. He looked small, fragile, and utterly pathetic, surrounded by the towering armored silhouettes of the task force. The march to the transport vehicles was an agonizing gauntlet of absolute public shame. Federal agents grabbed them by the biceps, forcefully propelling them forward through the driving rain. The blinding red and blue strobes of a dozen cruisers illuminated their spectacular defeat. No umbrellas were offered to shield them from the elements. No coats were draped over their heads to hide their faces from the dashcams recording every agonizing second of their subjugation. They were paraded directly in front of the stunned local airfield staff and the flight crew they had just frantically attempted to bribe, their degradation complete and absolute. A heavily armored Department of Justice transport van reversed aggressively toward them, its rear doors swinging wide open to reveal a cavernous, pitch-black interior. It reeked of industrial disinfectant, stale sweat, and damp steel. There were no plush leather seats, no climate-controlled luxury, and no concierge service. Preston was shoved roughly inside his knees, hitting the hard, unforgiving metal floorboards. Gregory was thrown in a moment later, collapsing onto the rigid bench seating with a breathless, rattling cough. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, the metallic boom reverberating through the claustrophobic cage like a final gavel strike. The internal locks engaged with a heavy, definitive clank, plunging them into near-total darkness. The engine of the transport vehicle roared to life, vibrating through the metal chassis. Preston leaned his bleeding head against the cold steel mesh of the window grate, shivering uncontrollably in his ruined shirt. Through the rain-streaked glass, he watched the silver Gulfstream, the multi-million-dollar chariot that was supposed to deliver him to untouchable freedom, slowly recede into the distance as the van accelerated away from the airstrip. He was entirely stripped of his armor, his syndicate, his legacy, and his wealth, reduced to a destitute ghost, riding in a cage toward absolute oblivion. The shockwaves generated by that rain-soaked night rippled outward with devastating, unrelenting velocity. Within 48 hours of the tarmac ambush, the sprawling monolithic network of Broadmoor rehab and wellness centers was completely and violently decapitated. Armed agents from the Department of Health and Human Services, flanked by an army of forensic accountants and tactical teams, descended simultaneously on 42 clinical locations spread across 12 states. Patients were safely transferred to legitimate state-run facilities, complicit medical staff were detained and interrogated on-site, and heavy steel padlocks were chained across the gilded glass doors of every single fraudulent clinic. A federal judge immediately placed the entire corrupt enterprise into strict government receivership, effectively halting the syndicate's merciless cash-printing machine overnight. Court-appointed auditors systematically tore through the servers, uncovering decades of phantom billing ghost patients and lethal calculated medical negligence. The pristine corporate facade dissolved entirely, exposing the rotten, blood-soaked scaffolding beneath. The lucrative empire built on the suffering of vulnerable addicts was dismantled brick by brick, its assets liquidated to feed the restitution trusts. The untouchable matriarch, Beatrice Broadmoor, faced a reckoning she had never conceived possible in her most terrifying nightmares. The sprawling palatial estate that had hosted countless lavish Thanksgiving galas and shielded her from the consequences of her family's actions was summarily seized under aggressive RICO forfeiture statutes. Federal marshals arrived at the iron perimeter gates of the compound, not with deference, but with a highly publicized immediate eviction order. Beatrice was granted exactly 1 hour to pack a single standard-issue suitcase under the watchful, unsympathetic gaze of heavily armed officers. Every piece of heirloom jewelry, every designer gown, and every priceless antique was tagged and cataloged as hard evidence of criminal proceeds. The formidable, terrifying woman who had ruled her dynasty with a silk-gloved iron fist was reduced to a weeping, trembling shell as she was escorted off the property she believed she would own forever. Stripped of her immense wealth and the terrifying aura of the Broadmoor name, Beatrice was forced to relocate to a decrepit, neon-lit motel off a noisy interstate highway. Trapped in a cramped room smelling faintly of stale tobacco and mildew, she awaited her own impending federal trial for criminal complicity. Her only regular visitors were the relentless paparazzi camped out by the vending machines, eager to capture the spectacular misery of her fall from grace. Delilah's descent was equally swift and profoundly humiliating, a steep plunge from the pinnacle of high society into absolute destitution. The federal freeze orders targeted every single one of her offshore accounts, domestic trusts, and shell company holdings with surgical precision. Her platinum credit cards were declined at luxury boutiques, leaving her stranded at cash registers in front of mocking crowds. Her private gym memberships, country club affiliations, and elite social standing were instantly revoked. Panicked and utterly financially paralyzed, she found herself completely isolated. The wealthy, influential circles that had once courted her favor and eagerly attended her extravagant charity luncheons immediately severed all ties, treating her like a highly infectious disease. Desperation rapidly eroded her haughty arrogance. She spent her days frantically dialing the offices of high-powered defense attorneys, begging for pro bono representation or deferred payment plans. When those mahogany doors slammed shut in her face, she was reduced to tearfully pleading for leniency from the very federal prosecutors she had once publicly mocked. She desperately tried to trade non-existent leverage for a reduced prison sentence, but she possessed nothing left to bargain with. Her brother and father had already taken the ultimate fall, and the government had absolutely zero interest in cutting deals with the pathetic, powerless remnants of the operation. The total obliteration of the Broadmoor family rapidly morphed into an unprecedented global media sensation. Cable news networks and investigative journalists operated on a relentless 24-hour cycle, dissecting every morbid detail of the anatomy of the collapse. Flashing chyrons labeling them the medical mafia crawled across millions of television screens worldwide. Investigative specials aired prime-time exposés detailing the staggering scale of the insurance fraud, the intricate Cayman Island shell games, and the ruthless sociopathic exploitation of patients. With every broadcast, the massive, irrefutable matrix of evidence Gwen had meticulously compiled was paraded before the public and legally validated. The meticulous spreadsheets cross-referencing fake billing codes, the intercepted audio files of Preston threatening clinic directors, the cloned biometric logs proving Gregory's direct involvement. All of it was authenticated, verified, and weaponized by the Department of Justice. Gwen's shadow war was vindicated on a massive, undeniable stage. The prosecutors did not need to spin a complex narrative for the grand jury or the watching world. They simply presented the devastating, unassailable facts she had seamlessly handed them on a silver platter. Every shred of data she had extracted from their encrypted servers acted as a lethal strike against the syndicate's defense team. The public spectacle served as the final crushing nail in the coffin of the Broadmoor legacy. The once feared family name was permanently transformed into a universal synonym for unparalleled greed, toxic hubris, and spectacular ruin. The towering empire of manipulation and deceit had been burned to the ground, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of their vanity and the undeniable triumph of the woman they had fatally underestimated. While the ashes of the Broadmoor dynasty settled across the eastern seaboard, in a highly publicized spectacle of ruin, a distinctly different kind of revolution was taking root in the damp, evergreen-scented landscape of Seattle. The sudden, violent decapitation of the rehab and wellness centers had created a massive, terrifying administrative vacuum in the Pacific Northwest. The entire regional board of directors, a carefully curated collection of Gregory's sycophants, corrupt local politicians, and Delilah's country club cronies, had been simultaneously ousted. Their luxury company vehicles were unceremoniously towed from reserved parking spaces, and their lavish corner offices were bolted shut behind bright yellow federal evidentiary tape. In their immediate absence, a profound humanitarian crisis loomed over the thousands of vulnerable patients actively undergoing addiction treatment within the network. The Washington State Department of Health, acting under emergency, midnight injunctions from the Attorney General executed an immediate occupational takeover to prevent the total collapse of patient care. The state desperately needed an architect to rebuild the shattered, blood-soaked infrastructure. They required someone with an unblemished medical license, an intimate understanding of the syndicate's specific operational architecture, and an absolute moral compass. They found their savior in Dr. Jamal Hayes. Throughout the agonizing duration of the federal investigation, Jamal had operated as a quiet, indispensable, and deeply courageous asset. While his soon-to-be ex-wife Delilah had been busy flaunting her unearned wealth and subjecting him to a relentless barrage of condescending, racially coded microaggressions, Jamal had been systematically downloading encrypted patient records. He had risked his own medical license and personal safety to hand irrefutable proof of the syndicate's atrocities directly to the authorities. His absolute refusal to participate in the phantom billing schemes or overprescribe highly addictive maintenance medications had completely ostracized him from the family trust, but it had preserved his soul. Recognizing his impeccable clinical integrity and his instrumental role in dismantling the cartel, the state health commissioner chose to bypass the usual bureaucratic red tape. In a decisive, widely televised press conference, the governor officially appointed Jamal as the interim medical director for the entire restructured Western Division. The title was not merely ceremonial, it came with sweeping absolute executive authority to tear the old system down to its studs. Jamal wasted absolutely no time executing a total systemic purge of the corporate rot. Walking into the regional headquarters on his first official day, he deliberately bypassed the lavish mahogany-paneled executive suites favored by his former in-laws. Instead, he commandeered a functional glass-walled office situated directly on the bustling clinical floor, signaling an immediate end to the ivory tower era. His first executive directive was a brutal, uncompromising termination of every regional manager and mid-level administrator associated with the predatory billing quotas. The infamous, deeply unethical algorithm designed by Preston to maximize insurance payouts by keeping addicts in a perpetual loop of relapse and readmission was permanently deleted from the mainframes. In its place, Jamal instituted evidence-based holistic treatment protocols focused on actual recovery and long-term sobriety. He mandated transparent cost structures, slashed bloated administrative overhead to fund actual frontline nursing staff, and established an independent ethics oversight committee comprising community advocates and recovered patients. The transition was grueling. The corporate culture of profit-driven cruelty did not evaporate overnight, but Jamal met every pocket of resistance with unrelenting, uncompromising dedication to actual medical healing. He fired complicit physicians on the spot and reported them to the medical board. He worked brutal, exhausting 18-hour shifts personally, reviewing patient charts to undo the pharmacological damage inflicted by the previous regime. Yet for the first time in a decade, the physical and mental exhaustion felt clean, earned, and profoundly meaningful. The patients previously treated as expendable commodities on a spreadsheet began to receive genuine empathetic care. The dedicated medical staff who had suffered under the Broadmoor tyranny rallied behind Jamal, their cynicism dissolving into genuine hope. The arduous labor of untangling the bureaucratic nightmare was deeply, intensely cathartic. Every terminated ghost contract and every restructured clinical policy served as a deliberate exorcism of the Broadmoor influence from his life. For years, he had endured their suffocating, toxic presence. He had swallowed his pride at insufferable country club dinners where Gregory would make thinly veiled aristocratic remarks about Jamal's background, dripping with generational prejudice. He had endured Beatrice's venomous elitist scrutiny, analyzing his every word and gesture through a lens of inherent superiority. Most painfully, he had suffered Delilah's grotesque narcissistic belief that she had somehow elevated him by marrying him constantly, weaponizing her family's wealth to assert dominance and diminish his professional achievements. The insidious racist undercurrents that had poisoned his marriage and threatened to infect the minds of his children were finally, permanently eradicated. He was no longer the marginalized, targeted outsider in a dynasty of sociopaths. He was the undisputed architect of their replacement. Late on a rainy Friday evening, as the bustling clinic outside his door finally quieted down to a low, comforting hum of nighttime activity, Jamal stood alone in his new office. The sterile scent of hospital-grade cleaner had never smelled so sweet. He walked over to his modest wooden desk, completely ignoring the towering stacks of newly compliant state health mandates and operational budgets awaiting his signature. Instead, he reached into his worn leather messenger bag and carefully extracted a silver-framed photograph. It was a candid, beautifully captured snapshot of his young son and daughter, laughing wildly in a sunlit park, their faces bright with innocent, unburdened joy. They were completely untouched by the dark, rotting legacy of their mother's family, shielded from the corruption that had almost consumed them all. Jamal placed the frame meticulously on the exact center of the desk, adjusting the angle until it perfectly caught the warm, ambient light of his desk lamp. He gently touched the cool glass with his fingertips, a deep, resonant sigh escaping his chest as he looked at their smiling faces. The heavy, invisible shackles that had bound him for years were gone. The suffocating shadow of the Broadmoor Empire had finally lifted. Standing in the quiet sanctuary of the clinic he had saved, Dr. Jamal Hayes was entirely unequivocally free. Thousands of miles away from the rain-swept clinic in Seattle, a radically different atmosphere draped itself over the historic architecture of London. The brutal, suffocating storm of the Pacific Northwest was replaced by the crisp golden clarity of a pristine afternoon along the River Thames. The air was sharp and invigorating, carrying the faint, earthy scent of turning leaves and the distant rhythmic churn of commuter ferries navigating the waterway. Ancient willow trees cast long, dappled shadows across the manicured lawns of the quiet park, creating a tranquil sanctuary insulated from the frantic, pulsing energy of the surrounding metropolis. Here there were no tactical raids, no flashing sirens, and no shattered empires. There was only the gentle rustle of the wind and the unburdened sound of a child's laughter. Gwen sat comfortably on a weathered wooden bench, her posture completely devoid of the rigid, terrified tension that had defined her existence within the Broadmoor compound. She wore a simple tailored trench coat and a thick woolen scarf effortlessly blending into the cosmopolitan crowd of locals and tourists. The expensive, suffocating armor of designer dresses and flawless mandatory makeup had been entirely discarded. In its place was a woman who had reclaimed her own skin. The chronic dark circles beneath her eyes had faded, replaced by a profound, radiant calm. She breathed in the crisp London air, letting it fill her lungs completely, savoring the absolute absence of fear. She was untraceable, financially secure beyond comprehension, and entirely free. A few yards away, near the gentle slope of the grassy riverbank, 4-year-old Leo was engaged in a highly animated negotiation with a flock of mallard ducks. He held a torn piece of crusty baguette in his small, chubby hand, giggling wildly as the birds waddled closer, aggressively demanding their prize. His bright, clear eyes danced with innocent delight, completely devoid of the dark, oppressive shadows that haunted the family he had left behind. He did not know the name Broadmoor. He did not know about the fraudulent clinics, the Cayman Islands shadow servers, or the ruthless syndicates. He would never be subjected to Gregory's chilling, manipulative grooming or Beatrice's aristocratic cruelty. He would never be conditioned to view other human beings as disposable commodities. He was just a little boy safely tucked into the vibrant, anonymous heart of a foreign city, secure in the fierce, uncompromising protection of a mother who had burned down an empire to guarantee his safety. Gwen watched him with a soft, genuine smile playing across her lips. The fierce maternal instinct that had driven her to execute the most dangerous, complex financial heist in modern history was now completely at rest. The offshore capital she had brilliantly routed away from Preston's encrypted ledger was securely fractured across dozens of untraceable legitimate international trusts, guaranteeing that Leo would have every opportunity in the world, cleanly separated from the blood money that had originally funded it. Deep within the pocket of her trench coat, a sudden sharp vibration shattered her quiet reverie. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted priority news alert. It was the singular specific notification parameter she had left active on her device, the final digital thread tying her to the smoking ruins of her past. Gwen reached into her pocket, retrieving the device. She swiped her thumb across the glass, unlocking a live high-definition video feed broadcast by a major American news network. The screen illuminated with the stark, gray, brutalist architecture of a federal courthouse in the United States. The dreary, overcast sky in the background perfectly matched the grim, chaotic scene unfolding on the concrete steps. A massive crowd of journalists, photographers, and angry protesters surged against heavy steel barricades, their camera flashes creating a relentless, blinding strobe effect. From the armored rear doors of a Department of Justice transport bus, the architects of the medical mafia emerged into the harsh daylight. Gwen watched in absolute silent fascination. There was Preston, his previously immaculate, arrogant posture entirely broken. He was hunched forward, his face pale and gaunt, clad in a highly visible, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The heavy industrial iron chains binding his wrists and ankles clanked audibly against the concrete steps, forcing him into a pathetic, shuffling gait. The man who had once believed his wealth elevated him to the status of a god was now just another shackled inmate, his eyes darting nervously away from the camera lenses. Behind him came Gregory. The patriarch looked utterly devastated, stripped of the bespoke tailoring and intimidating aura that had shielded his crimes for decades. He stumbled slightly under the weight of his chains, looking frail, terrified, and undeniably old. Finally, Beatrice was guided out by two stern female marshals. The imperious matriarch, who had once ruled her social circle with venomous authority, kept her head bowed deeply, her unstyled hair falling across her face to hide her spectacular humiliation from the world. The absolute untouchable arrogance that had defined the Broadmoor bloodline had been entirely methodically beaten out of them by the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. They were exposed, ruined, and facing the absolute certainty of spending the rest of their natural lives behind reinforced concrete walls. Gwen did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive glee, nor did she feel the need to gloat. The sight simply provided a deep, settling wave of closure. The scales of the universe had been aggressively, permanently balanced. The predators were caged, the victims were avenged, and the nightmare was definitively over. She pressed the side button on her phone, turning off the display. The chaotic, screaming images of the federal courthouse vanished instantly, replaced by the dark, blank reflection of the glass. She tucked the device back into the deep pocket of her coat, severing that final connection forever. Gwen tilted her head back, closing her eyes as she let the bright, crisp sunlight wash over her face. The warmth felt like a benediction. She listened to the joyful, unrestrained sound of Leo laughing by the water's edge. The memory of that dreadful, suffocating night in the mansion flashed through her mind one last time. They had looked at her with pure disdain. They had demanded she apologize or get out. She got out, but she ensured they would be the ones spending the rest of their miserable lives paying for their sins. The striking lesson from Gwen's quiet victory is that true power never roars. It meticulously plans. When faced with overwhelming toxicity and systemic corruption, she did not waste energy trying to fix people who were fundamentally broken, nor did she surrender to their abusive narrative. Instead, she chose calculated self-preservation, severing the heavy chains holding her back. Her journey teaches us that walking away is never an act of cowardice. It is the ultimate assertion of personal agency and strength. Reclaim your narrative today by setting one firm boundary against negativity and share your experience in the comment below.